in which they engage a kind of birth of linguistics, Deleuze and Guattari in that section. So that's a very interesting moment in all of this, where they're basically taking on all the linguistic schools, Chomsky, de Saussure, and others. So this is in plateau number 4, if I remember correctly. I don't have the book in front of me, but it's called The Postulates of Linguistics. And this is very important to get their idea of how they do linguistics differently, what they will call a pragmatics, not the way we use pragmatic in the United States, out of James to Peirce, although Peirce is influential on Deleuze, and once we get there, we can speak to that, and or William James. So it's a very different approach than the pragmatics of, quote, human communication and language. So we'll go back to that. And apropos what Patrick had requested, I think it's best I do the Spinoza thing and capital in terms of its axiomatics next week, as we get it more into the schizoid analysis. Spinoza plays an active role, and we can go back around to the body without organs as being, in some ways, a Deleuzian concept that he borrows from Spinoza, or what Spinoza calls actually the thinking body. So we'll go back to this as well. Yeah, ultimately. So, okay, there are a couple of more people filtering in. Yeah, that's what I'd like to do. I mean, tonight, obviously, I want to, focus somewhat, and I'm certainly, as usual, open to interventions. But I do want to focus on this Urstadt, because it seems to be a transitional section in the Anti-Oedipus. I just want to mention again, if you go back to pages 100, and I'm going to move around a little bit tonight, because I think it's good to look at this book, certainly not as linear, certainly not as an organic unfolding. They're always moving back and forth for things they've already concretized earlier. So I want to go back again to at least to point to this, the question of the 3 types of syntheses, and this is happening on page 100, 101 in relation to Oedipus and the Holy Family, and then of course the second synthesis, the disjunction, 106, 107, 108. I'm not going to go over these again, but I will say this is very important. And then of course the conjunctive. So if there's a correspondence between these syntheses, if you want to look at this in terms of some kind of relational, correspondence or correlationality to the 3 moments that they're speaking of here, savages into the barbarian, machine, and the new kind of territorialism that's taking place in the barbarian moment into the civilized machine, you can read correspondingly the connective, the disjunctive, and the conjunctive in relation to these, and they're operating at these levels. So these are always going on between these two, these types of syntheses. So I'd like to, again, keep that in mind. Another thing I recommend, I know I said this many times, but if you look at section 17 in particular of the Genealogy of Morals, of the second essay, very crucial, and I thank Josh last week bringing Nietzsche back into the fold for us. And if you read section 17 in the second essay, I think you'll get a sense of what they're trying to do through Nietzsche. This is very, very thing. Okay. So good. I see, Josh, you're the co-host for now. Yeah. Okay.
Not for any particular reason.
Oh, not for any particular. Okay. All right. I think Matt may have stepped out for a second. I don't know. But anyway, okay. So I'm going to just read one section of this, because this will lead into the Urstadt. He says, among the presuppositions of this hypothesis concerning the origin of bad conscience, and this is Nietzsche, section 17 of the second essay in the Genealogy of Morals. is first that the change referred to was not a gradual or a voluntary one and did not represent an organic adaptation to new conditions, but a break. And this notion of break or rupture, break is probably better for our purpose, a leap, a compulsion, an ineluctable disaster which precluded all struggle and even all ressentiment. Secondly, however, that the welding of a hitherto unchecked and shapeless populace into a firm form was not only instituted by an act of violence, but also carried to its conclusion, but nothing but acts of violence, that the oldest state thus appeared as a fearful tyranny, as an oppressed and remorseless machine, and went on working until this raw material of people and semi-animals were at last not only thoroughly kneaded and pliant, but also formed. Okay, very, very interesting section, this section. I employed the word state. It is obvious what is meant. Some pack of blonde beasts of prey. And I certainly recommend, if you don't have the Genealogy of Morals, it's the book you take to the desert island to really study. It's a very, very influential book and hugely influential on Freud, to put it mildly. A conqueror and a master race which organized for war, and with the ability to organize, unhesitatingly lays its terrible claws upon a populace perhaps tremendously superior in numbers, but still formless and nomad. That is, after all, how the state began on earth. I think that sentimentalism, which would have it begin with a contract, this is great. This is obviously an attack on contract theory, and especially Rousseau, who Nietzsche had an ongoing antagonism to, right? Has been disposed of. He who can command, by who is by nature master. He who is violent in act and bearing, what does he have to do with contracts? Exclamation point. One does not reckon with such natures. They come like fate. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari, re-emphasize in the section on the Urstadt. They come like fate, without reason, without consideration, without pretext. They appear as lightning appears, too terrible, too sudden, too convincing, too different, even to be hated. Their work is an instinctive creation and an imposition of forms. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists there are. I like this. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists there are. Wherever they appear, something new soon arises, a ruling structure that lives, in which parts and functions are delimited and coordinated, in which nothing whatever finds a place that has not been first assigned a meaning in relation to the whole. They do not know what guilt, responsibility, or consideration are. These born organizers, they exemplify that terrible artist's egoism that has the look of bronze and knows itself justified to all eternity in its work, the parenthesis, quotation marks, end quote, like a mother in her child. It is not in them that the bad conscience developed, that goes without saying, but it would not have developed without them. This notion of bad conscience and, of course, guilt, the formation of guilt and debt. This ugly growth, it would be lacking if a tremendous quantity of freedom had not been expelled from the world, or at least from the visible world, and made it, as it were, latent under their hammer blows and artist violence. This instinct for freedom, or drive for freedom, I think it's drive in German, forcibly made latent. We have seen it already, this instinct for freedom pushed back and repressed, incarnated within, and finally able to discharge and vent itself only on itself. That and that alone is what the bad conscience is in its beginnings. So this is the beginning of the creditor-debtor relationship and the debtor himself. And this is, I'm going to turn to the Urstadt. Preface this by Nietzsche. And again, I really suggest, if you have the time, to read particularly the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals. This is a very important text for Anti-Oedipus to, I think, give a fuller and hopefully a more productive encounter for all of you. So let me just get to the Urstadt here. I want to begin there tonight. So we talked a lot last week, and thank you, Carl, on the despotic machine, right? And we talked about the despot and what happens to in this moment, and what happens about in desire. Desire no longer, dares to desire, in a sense, in the despotic. But then we have the Urstadt. So I'm going to go to page 217. This is section 8 in the Anti-Oedipus text. And the section is called Urstadt, the primary or the first state, if you will. The city of the point of departure of Abraham or the new alliance. The state was not formed in progressive stages, a la Nietzsche, as he tells us, the breaks, the ruptures, etc. It appears fully armed, a master stroke executed all at once. The primordial Urstadt, the eternal model of everything the state wants to be and desires. Our Asiatic production, as most of you know, Mark's long sections on this, and one of the great rewritings of that. I mentioned this, and again, a great book to read, Oriental Despotism. It makes Max Weber look like a child, that kind of reading on bureaucracies, I promise you. Franz Wittfogel, one of the peripheral to the Frankfurt School, where the state that expresses or constitutes its objective moment is not a distinct formation, it is the basic formation. Again, the state formation, the basic, on the horizon throughout history. There comes back to us from all quarters the discovery of an imperial machine or imperial machines that preceded the traditional historical forms. Machines characterized by state ownership of property with communal possession bricked into it and collective dependence. Every form that is more evolved is like a palimpsest. It covers a despotic inscription, a Mycenaean manuscript. Under every black and every Jew, there is an Egyptian and a Mycenaean under the Greeks, an Etruscan under the Romans, right? And yet their origin sinks into oblivion, a latency that lays hold of the state itself, and where the writing system sometimes disappears. It is beneath the blows of private property, then of commodity production, that the state witnesses its decline. Land enters into the sphere of private property, into that of commodities. Classes appear, inasmuch as the dominant classes are no longer merged with the state apparatus, but are distinct determinations that make use of this transformed apparatus. At first situated adjacent to communal property, then entering into the latter's composition or conditioning it, then becoming more and more a determining force, private property brings about an internalization of the creditor-debtor relation in the relations of opposed classes. Very interesting. The birth of class struggle, if you will, they're looking at here, phenomenologically trying to look at the birth of this. But how does one explain both this latency into which the despotic state enters? Remember, they're moving from the despotic machine into the Urstadt, and this power with which it reforms itself on modified foundations in order to spring back more mendacious, colder, and more hypocritical than others. We can probably take the Biden administration in another 100 days and start articulating this of what's going on vis-a-vis the continuation of the 1938 formation of the warfare state in the United States. That a man like Donald Trump, as our friend Peter Bratsis, myself, and Bruno found out on Saturday, is indigenous to America. He was not an aberration or a deviation. And as you probably know, Space Force is underway. There's a huge amount of budget for this. All of these things are the outgrowth. Please don't let anybody fool you. This is about military, hegemony. The whole Cold War with China we're not behind China in technology. We just want to control it, in a sense. Just like we were never behind the Soviet Union in missile production in the 1960s and 70s. We basically bankrupted the Soviet Union. They had to spend so much money catching up with us in the arms race. And those of you that know Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick seeing this as early as the 1960s, early 60s, in the war room. So anyway, I'll go back to this. This oblivion and this return, on the one hand, and this is brilliant, the ancient city-state, the Germanic commune, and feudalism presuppose the great empires and cannot be understood except in terms of the Urstadt that serves as their horizon. On the other hand, the problem confronting these forms is to reconstitute the Urstadt insofar as possible, given the requirements of their new distinct determinations. For what do private property, wealth, commodities, and classes signify? They signify the breakdown of codes. We begin to have a new breakdown of codes in this Urstadt. The appearance, the surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the socius, crossing it from one end to the other. The state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded. It must invent specific codes for flows that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations, right? The new class relations. Integrated the relations of wealth and poverty, of commodity and labor, reconciling market money and money from revenues, everywhere stamping the mark of the Urstadt on the new state of things, and everywhere the presence of the latent model that can no longer be equaled, but then one can help but imitate. The Egyptians' melancholy warning to the Greeks echoes throughout history, and this is beautiful. This is the beginning of, I don't know if you know this, Bruno knows this, the Timaeus. You Greeks are mere children. The great dialogue of Plato, the Timaeus, which is about spheres and movements, etc., and motion in place, which Aristotle then takes up in the physics, especially in book 4. Yeah, so very, very interesting that we're, you Greeks will be nothing but children. And this is the pretext on which, by the way, Martin Bernal uses this in Black Athena, for those of you interested in that. Black Athena uses this actual quote to, get out of the revised ancient model and the ancient models. Even though he's proposing a revised ancient model, it's to take into account this thing that Anti-Oedipus in 72, or even earlier when they're writing this, is already presupposing. Bernal takes this up in Black Athena, on the Afro-Asiatic roots of linguistics. Okay, this special situation of the state as a category, oblivion and return, this is phenomenology at work, has to be explained. To begin with, it should be said that the primordial despotic state is not a historical break like any other. And you can hear the echoes of the Communist Manifesto here, this bourgeoisie class that comes out, even though it's organic grows in Marx and Engels' view from the burger classes and the destruction of feudalism. But anyway, let's go on. Of all the institutions, it is perhaps the only one to appear fully armed in the brain of those who institute it. Very interesting to be fully armed. The artists with a look of bronze, the reference back to Nietzsche. That is why Marxism didn't quite know what to make of it. It has no place in the famous 5 stages: primitive communism, ancient city-states, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. It is not one formation among others, nor is it a transition from one formation to another. It appears to be set back at a remove from what it transects and from which it resects, as though it was giving an evidence of another dimension, a cerebral ideality that is added to, superimposed on the material evolution of societies, a regulating idea or principle of reflection, i.e. terror, that organize the parts and the flows into a whole. What is transected, supersected, or overcoated by the despotic state is what comes before, the territorial machine, which it reduces to the state of bricks of working parts henceforth subjected to the cerebral idea. In this series, and remember they're working through a series here, or in this sense, right? The despotic state is indeed the origin, but the origin as an abstraction that must include its differences with respect to the concrete beginning. We know that myth always expresses a passage and a divergence. The primitive territorial myth of the beginning expressed the divergence of a characteristically intense energy, what Marcel Proust called the metaphysical part of mythology. The vibratory spiral, very interesting, in relation to the social system in extension that it conditioned, passing back and forth between, remember last week, the alliance, the flows of alliance, flows of filiation. But the imperial myth of the origin expresses something else. The divergence of this beginning from the origin itself, the divergence of the extension from the idea, of the genesis from the order, and the power, the new alliance, and also from what repasses from filiation to alliance, what is taken up again by filiation. Jean-Pierre Vernat, those of you who don't know, you should know who Jean-Pierre Vernat is. I'm sorry, but one of the great classical scholars. Great. Myth and Thought in Ancient Greece, among many other books, but one of his fundamental, the great classical school, The Origins of Greek Myth, another book, shows in this way that the imperial myths are not able to conceive a law of organization that is immanent in the universe. They need to posit and internalize this difference beyond or between the origin and the beginnings, between the sovereign power and the genesis of the world. The myth, and this is Vernat speaking, the myth constitutes itself within this distance. It makes it into the very object of its narrative, retracing the avatars of sovereignty down through the succession of generations to the moment which a supremacy, this time definitive, puts an end to the dramatic elaboration of the Dynastia. Very, very interesting. Yep. So in the end, one no longer really knows what comes first and whether the territorial machine does not, in fact, presuppose a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks, or that it segments in its turn. Okay, so maybe I can stop there. I don't want to read the whole passage. I don't know how much you went into this. I should, say earlier so we could focus on it. I'm just wondering how you took to this. This is about 5 pages. I'd like to begin there because this Urstadt is the building block of which we get to the civilized, capitalist machine. And anybody on this? And want to? I mean, is it too far out there? Yeah. They're really looking at this, how this alliance, right, is transformed by these artists that come out of nowhere in order to build this state, its apparatus, and create something much worse than the despotic signifier. Yes, Carl. Yeah.
I just, this was, in part a question. I mean, this seems very much out of, the genealogy of morals. And I was wondering how you read this and maybe other people read where they, talk about, this is on page 219, sort of towards the top, the section giving evidence of another dimension, a cerebral ideality that is added to, superimposed on the material evolution of societies. And then they also talk about, I don't know quite where it is, but where it's sort of adopted and to the, given the requirements of their new distinct determinations. So it seems almost like they're not talking so much about a specific moment or place in history where the Urstadt emerges, right? But they're talking about something that's more general, almost like underlying. It's almost like a genetic code of the coding, right?
Yeah, well, the Ohrstadt itself, the language, I think is pointing to that. They're really looking about this coming from nowhere, this lightning that strikes, these masters that bring with them. And I know the cerebral ideality, is a thing where the ideas have built up in the mind, right? It is not based only on material conditions. It is an idea. They have a lot of Platonism in them, in some ways, in some ways, you know. So this is a production of a kind of, when they go back this far, they're looking at idealities as well, right? Going on. It's not only material conditions. And this raises, a lot of questions about, idealism and materialism. I think they're in both camps in some ways, when it serves them best. But anyway, and again, they want to avoid. To them, this is an imminent moment in history. It's a plane of imminence that is happening. We don't really locate it in a moment, but we're imminently trying to understand this, right? This is really what they're, again, trying to do before we get to the point of the civilized capitalist machine. So they're building towards that. Yeah. Yeah. Again. Yeah.
How do you see Nietzsche understanding this when he's writing the Genealogy of Morals, and particularly the second essay? How do you think
Well,
he's
he's looking at how debt is being formed. How is the debtor, or what Freud would call, of course, the superego, what the religious folks would call the conscience? How does guilt itself, as obligation, Schuld in German also means indebtedness, they're looking at these structures of guilt in the family and other things to really look at, what is this origin of indebtedness, this whole thing of this master moment that happens in history that creates this creditor-debitor relationship. And it's not so easily just, talked about in terms of, capital accumulation or capital formation in some ways. Yeah. So I think that's what they're trying to go through. This is a genealogical analysis that has dialectics in it, in a sense, because they're connecting things in terms of the synthesis, but it's a genealogy looking at this movement from filiation to alliance, right? In a sense, right? Yeah, yeah. And and how kinship relations are formed and all this. This is involving the state. Once again, to me, it's a rereading. I'm imposing my own background here, but anyway, bear with me. To me, it is this Nietzsche and Nietzschean view of history as a genealogical, moment, and thinking of genealogy as a concerted carnival, a way of finding monumental, ancient, and critical history in one, right, moment, right, etc., and the founding of the state. And for them, this is a reading that they find productive of the origin of the family, private property, and the state. That's the pretext throughout this. That's why they go through these 5 stages, right? This is Engels, is part of the antagonist here and a protagonist. They're both, again, like throughout this book, they're both for and against, but again, trying to connect off of them, right? And then begin their own movement here, their own genealogical movement. If that makes sense to you, they're looking, where does private property come from? Where does privatization then come from? Basically, it's not until later that we get privatization in these moments, right? Yeah. So go ahead, Carl. I'm listening.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to follow our protocol of
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. No, I can see. I'm,
um,
I'm not blind yet. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm like Oedipus. Yeah.
again, this is just my own. This is more reflective of my own background.
Right.
But I like the Genealogy of Morals. It's my favorite work by Nietzsche that I've read. But I also find it that I'm a little resistant to this kind of, I guess, just sort of, explanation of things, because I think that how states evolve and the production of territorialities and these, recodings that I think, I like a lot of their language, but I don't think that there's just this sort of flashing moment. I mean,
The
maybe,
state for them is an overcoding. It's not a
right, right,
recoding, it's an
yeah,
overcoding. Ultimately, what the project is through the schizoid analysis is to break down the state's codings, right?
hmm
This is where the schiz or the break, this moment is happening, where the light is in many ways.
yeah,
Okay. So this is where they're trying to go. This is an antagonistic relation, not in the anarchist sense to statism, but it is an antagonistic relation to state coding, right?
hmm
And this overcoding, etc. You know, yeah. So
it
very,
seems
very
like
important
the
to remember.
movement is to almost read backwards, though, that you,
Yes, yeah,
rather than, the usual history of, you try and understand, the breakdown of a given set of relations, why
right.
it breaks down, and then how a new organization emerges out of that. That it's almost like looking at the end product and then reading back, it has this originary moment that then explains what we now have.
Well, I mean, I want to take, I mean, again, the Ursprung, the emergence is more important here. I think this is, again, when you're doing philosophy and when you're doing the French reading of German philosophy, Ursprung is the word for origin, but it doesn't mean like the English origin, where we're going to locate the origin of this fossil that's going to give us this dating, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
It means when something emerges or springs forth, right? If we can keep that in mind, we may be, getting, somewhere in what they're again trying to do. This Ursprung, Heidegger's the translation of his work on the work of art is the origin of the work. It's a terrible translation. It's where the work emerges, how it comes to light, etc. Yeah, in many ways, right? So this is very, very important to keep in mind. Again, I think they're really trying to look. This is a very crucial element. The reason I wanted to start here is that it is the element on which the next section, civilized, machine, is built, right? And we could read it retrospectively because there is a reaccounting of Freud later in the and what they've done in the entire three sections, the savages, the barbarians, and the civilized men. They recount this all and synthesize it at the end before they're going to go on to the practice of schizoid analysis and why it's important. Let me just, David, please. Yeah, I see you're yeah, unmuted. Yeah.
Michael, I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about a concept they get into in this phase of the Greek notion of the dynastia.
That's the dynasty, right? Yeah.
That is that literally what that means? The
Yeah,
dynasty.
it's an empire building, or how it happens. Let me yeah. Yeah.
So when they say, I'm just
They're
trying to.
they're taking on the notion of the dynasty. If you look at the footnote on 219
Uh-huh.
regarding whether it is possible to bring Asiatic, again, they're in these internal dialogues as well, to
Mhm.
bring Asiatic production into agreement with the five stages, and regarding the reasons behind Engels' renunciation of this category in Origins of the Family and the Russian Chinese Marxists resistance to this category. See Maurice Gaultier on the motor. One might see the the insults that go to Wittfogel for having raised this simple question: wasn't the category of the Oriental despotic state challenged for a reason having to do with its special paradigmatic status as a horizon for modern socialist states? Yeah. So. Yeah, again, yeah. I, so yeah, the dynasty is at work here too. I mean, yeah, this is what they're also talking about. Look, the Greek dynasty begins with the house of Agamemnon. Agamemnon, in terms of a choice, if you want to go through this in terms of this disjunctive synthesis, or what they refer to as the double bind, the first double bind, or the double hold, may be even a better translation to go beyond Bateson, right? The double hold of Western culture is the choice between the family and the state.
Mhm.
Very interesting if you think about that. Agamemnon is faced with the decision, shall I sacrifice my youngest daughter to the goddess of the hunt? Very interesting. It's Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, who is going to appropriate Iphigenia, the daughter, right? Right? And that Agamemnon will sacrifice his daughter in the name of the state. This is one founding myth alongside that of Abraham, the Urstadt, as well as territorial representation, right? How this territorial representation takes place. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know Hebrew well, but it's my understanding in Hebrew that the word for salvation also means spaciousness. And Abraham himself was very spatial and, territorial. When you really think about this, and what is Abraham's choice about whether to sacrifice? And Kierkegaard's brilliant on this, as most of us know, in Fear and Trembling, the teleological suspension of the ethical. Abraham is faced with the ethical dilemma: shall I sacrifice my only child, right? I mean, my son, right, my oldest son, Isaac, to God in order to, satisfy the gift and the exchange relationship, or should I not? And Kierkegaard reads this as a transcendent, a leap of faith, right? And you're in the moral universe instead of the ethical universe, right? This is very, very, so you have these two moments in the Judaic Christian, cultures. They're trying to go beyond, of course. They're going to look at the Chinese, the Egyptians, the role of the Egyptian and the Greeks, etc. So this is all happening at once. But if you think about this, the house of Atreus begins everything that leads up to Oedipus. Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, Electra seducing her brother to kill her mother, who dared to take up a lover while her father was at war, right? Who took over the city state, right? So you have one complex and myth after another. First, the myth, of course, the narrative, the tragedians working with this, Euripides being much more, in my view of Greek tragedy, more of an engagé, right? It's actually an action taken by a woman using her brother, right? Speaking of incest too, again, all these things that they're speaking about. Then we get to the house of Laius, right? Also descended from the house of Agamemnon and Atreus to Laius, Oedipus, Jocasta, Antigone, Ismene, these things. So all of this is, I think, playing out for them genealogically, right? That they understand very well. And they're really looking to see how ultimately this becomes, quote unquote, incorporated, right, into these founders of the state, right? How all of this becomes integrated, if you will, where they come out of. And, so the once again, Oedipus, anti-Lacan in some ways, in a different way. That's a more complicated matter. Always means, again, I want to point out this use of a term that we misuse many times. We're anti-establishment. No, in a way, we're part of it, unfortunately, in compensation for and in opposition to. So this is always going on in their readings here. And I don't know if that helps, but Nietzsche, please. Yeah.
It does very much. But what I was wondering in this way, they have a very specific thing they say relative to this, which goes, the myth constitutes itself within this distance, makes it into the very object of its narrative, retracing the avatars of sovereignty down through the succession of generations to the moment when a supremacy, this time definitive, puts an end to the dramatic elaboration of the Dynastia.
Dave, what page are you on?
This is like the lower part of page 219 in the...
I had read from it. That's a quote, by the way, from Jean, Pierre Vernal.
Okay.
And I can go get the book, but I mean, I'm going to have to go to another room.
Okay. We wouldn't
the origins of Greek, yes, right. But anyway, that's a quote from Vernal that they're using here, right? Right. So in the end, no one really knows what comes first. Once again, whether the territorial machine does not in fact presuppose a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks, or that it segments it in its turn, or that it segments in its turn. So there's something that's going on here. Are we building blocks, building bricks in some ways, or extracting the bricks from this mythical, moment, right, if you will, or are we looking at the segments that happen in its form, right? And then they're going to go on. It's necessary to say what comes after the primal state in regard to what is restricted, resected by this state. And the abstraction always of a remove and struck by latency, but it always springs back and comes back deeper. I don't know if any of you, and I'll go to David Winters, who's had his hand up a long time. Anyway, I don't know if any of you have read the book by Norman O. Brown, Love's Body. He got into a big argument with Herbert Marcuse. They remain friends, but it's a great text about the Nixon years were really another way of strengthening, after Watergate, strengthening the state. It wasn't anything that really was a victory in a sense. What it did was it strengthened the state surveillance apparatus. It strengthened the state, in a sense. He's very interesting in this regard. The fathers and the sons and the revolt of the father. Very poetic. Again, I think of that alongside this book. Marcuse, of course, criticized him for idealism and being, trapped in some kind of poetics, that he didn't see the reality of what was going on in the counter-revolutionary moment. And, they had a long debate. But anyway, yeah, David, please. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's fine. I just had two kind of small
Sure.
or questions. First one connects to what you just said about actually the strengthening of the state post-Nixon years. Very small thing, like on page 218 towards the top, where they say, I'm losing it here, where they say that the private property, yes, okay, so private property, then commodity production, the state witnesses its decline beneath the blows of private property and commodity production. I'm confused the way that they're talking there about the decline of the state and the way that they're talking about sort of the becoming and the development of the state sort of in the rest of the section. And so I'm just like missing what
Okay,
they
I don't think they're talking about the decline of the state there.
Yeah.
I think they're talking about how the state then begins to overcode, right? And becomes even more powerful in this coding operation. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is I think this is what do private property, wealth, commodities, and classes signifying? They signify the breakdown of codes, the appearance, the surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the socius in this transit, crossing it from one end to the other. The state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded. It must invest specific codes for flows that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations. Think about this. It's very profound. And we're living through this right now, I think. Yeah. Integrating the relations of wealth and poverty, commodity and labor, reconciling market money and money from revenues, state capital and, private, fictitious capital, if you will, from revenue. Everywhere stamping the mark of the Urstaat on all things, on the new state of things. And everywhere the presence of the latent model can no longer be equaled, but one cannot help but imitate. And this is where they give a thing, the melancholic warning to the Greeks. It actually was the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon. Solon, you Greeks are mere children at the beginning of the Timaeus. It's the beginning narrative, I mean, it's like, instead of the Iliadic stranger that we have in the other dialogues, we have, the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon, who is the lawgiver, which is interesting. Solon is the lawgiver in the ancient society. Yeah. So I don't know if that helps, David. I mean, I hope it does.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, that's much more clear to me. The specific line where like it appears it is beneath the blows of private property, then of commodity production, that the state witnesses its decline. Like, I'm confused. The nod towards like the the language of witnessing the state witnessing its decline confuses me, because I understand the part of the argument that you're describing. And so
Okay.
that line about the witnessing its decline confuses me, because I'm not quite sure how that fits into the rest. I'll let everybody else with their hands up through this, though.
Okay, I'll go back to that. I think I know where we're going on that. Yeah.
Okay, great. And let me say, and then I'll turn it over completely to everybody else
Sure,
very quickly.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
question
Okay.
of origin, and we'll get to it in a few minutes, I'm sure, as well. But the question of origin, I think, comes up again at the very end of this section,
Yes.
where they describe the becoming of the state
Yes.
as an internalization and a spiritualization.
Yes.
And like, so what they're looking for at the origin is the origin of that internalization and spiritualization.
Right.
So like, the question for them is, how do you find the origin of that as the origin of the state, which is different than looking for the origin of like the management of production or the origin of management of contracts.
As does Nietzsche, by the way.
Right.
This to me is a long commentary on and attempt to disjunctive to conjunctive syntheses with Nietzsche's genealogy. Okay, Bruno, you haven't said anything, so you first, and then Carl, and we'll go back.
Yeah. Okay. No. I found already when I read it, the whole passage really interesting, especially start page 219, but starting already at the end of the bottom of page 218, when they say that the category, right, of the special situation of the state as a category must be explained, and they go on explaining it. But now, what I find really intriguing is the concept of abstraction, which really is the character of the Urstadt, right? And they say that on page 220, toward the end, there is a very important sentence where they say, but the despotic state is the abstraction that is realized. And then only...
Earlier, Bruno, earlier it says the same thing. Sorry to interrupt, but just to stay on the same page, they speak on 219, exactly what you're saying again on 220. In this sense, the despotic state is indeed the origin, but the origin as an abstraction that must include its differences with respect to the concrete beginning.
Right,
go
right.
ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I like, I had noticed that too, but the way it's put here, that it realizes itself only as abstraction. I mean, if you only want to stay on page 219, that's fine.
No. I just was saying that it's mentioned earlier. Yeah.
No, because of course, I mean, one thinks immediately of, the association is made to Marx, the Grundrisse, and then on page 221, they make that connection, right? When Marx speaks of the passage from the abstract to the concrete.
Yes.
In the Grundrisse. Someone is at the door, so I mute myself.
No, go ahead.
That's what I wanted to say, okay?
You're again referring to the movement of the abstract to the concrete, right? The beginning with the abstract. And also, speaking of the abstraction, remember, he does say, after what you just read, a protean state, yet there has never been but one state, the Urstadt. This is, again, what they're going back to, the one, before the many, right? The one state that may play out with distinct determinations, distinct levels, but again, it's the Urstadt, right? This emergence of this form that is so horrific in some ways to us. These monsters of the create this entity, if you will, this abstract entity of which we have to completely undo. So yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, Carl, you wanted to say something again?
I can. Okay.
Oh, Bruno, are you, or if anyone else?
No, sorry, someone was there, but no one was there actually. But no, I just wanted to say one more thing. I mean, because this is really important, I believe, this question, of course, of the abstraction, and maybe, Michael, you read that already, but on page 219 again, when they say, in this sense, the despotic state is indeed the origin as an abstraction, that I find this very interesting but difficult, right? I mean, what does that mean really when they say that must include its differences with respect to the concrete beginning? That's wonderful. It's really, amazing. But maybe we should unpack it a little.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, I think we have to read the whole thing, right,
Yeah.
again, to unpack it, right, what I read. I mean, if you want to, sure, of course.
No,
Yeah.
just for
good.
the sake of
What is
discussion,
planned?
because
Let's just go up a little bit.
I mean, if I may, because it's certainly they're not speaking the language of a traditional metaphysics, so it is not even the language of the grounding, say, type of a moment that one finds in Heidegger. But it's interesting precisely that they say it's not a break on page 218. It's not a historical break like any other. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to be precisely the moment of grounding. What then? I mean, it is what really destroys and reduces to the state of bricks the territorial machine, which therefore precedes the Urstadt itself. Right. So I mean, just just to offer some points maybe for a reflection. It's not answers that I have, but
Right. No, I understand. Yeah. Carl, go ahead. Yeah, please.
So, well, this is to kind of, also maybe throw like more complexity into all this, but I just thought of this during the discussion, and so this is a little vague in my mind. But they have sort of this juxtaposition of there's the primitive territorial machine, and then there's this recurrent theme of how then the despotic machine, but also the primitive territorial machine, are threatened by decoded flow. So these coding operations that they work through are ways to contain and regulate and reinscribe. Right, and that even capitalism we'll find out has a certain way of doing this. But to just bring some of the work on the history of money into this, because I think this is kind of relevant, is that it's not necessarily, I think, so dichotomous in a certain way in terms of a lot of the work on the origins of modern monetary systems look a lot at the role of state debt and the centrality of the state waging war and issuing debt to wage war is, of course, in some sense the ultimate territorialization of the state. But the debt is which is the basis of a lot of modern monetary forms. There's a whole argument that actually emerges out of these state operations. So many of the axiomatics that they'll talk about in the capitalist system actually have you could argue that they have their origins in these state operations where the state is issuing debt and then imposing through the power of the state taxation, right? So they impose an obligation on the population to pay off those debts, right? So I just think that it's perhaps more complicated than I think they keep positing this fairly simple. I mean, it's complex how they.
Well, I don't think it's that simple. If you turn to page 230, they cite Cezanne de Bruhoff, who was a first-rate French economist who wrote on money, theory of money, etc., and many things. And they have a very long, in the sense of the dualism of money, they go there. I mean, I don't think they're really trying to simplify
but that's
relation. But what she says, the very notion of a monetary mass can have a meaning only in relation, exactly what you're saying, relative to the working of a system of credit. This is on 230 footnote Bruhoff, of a system where the different kinds of money combine. Without such a system, one would only have a sum of means of payment that would have no access to the social nature of the general equivalent and that could serve only in local private circuits. There would be no general monetary circulation. Only in the centralized system can the different kinds of money become homogeneous and appear as components of an articulated whole, of an articulated whole.
Yeah.
So, I mean, here, but please go ahead. Yeah, I mean, you're the economist.
I know her work quite well, but I think what I'm trying to say, I think, is
Right.
that the state's territorializing operations, of which the waging of war to claim territory or defend territory in a literal sense, and the imposition of taxation, which is fundamental to how the state actually institutes power over a territory. I mean, the use of violence and the use of taxation are sort of the two foundations of the actual territorialization of a state, that those are actually very central to the generalization of the decoding that Deleuze and Guattari kind of keep posing as counter to the state. I'm just saying that I think that the relationship based on more recent work historically about the origins of money, David Graeber did some work around this. Also, it just I think throws this into it's not such a simple dichotomy.
No, I understand that.
I think is kind of what I'm saying. And this is very different than what de Brunoff is doing, where she's talking about credit money, exchange money, metallic.
Right.
It's a very different thing.
Right. Okay, Chris. Yeah, please. Yeah. And then Josepha. Yeah. Chris. Yeah. You want to unmute? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, from the very beginning, we're talking about Nietzsche. Nietzsche says that the whole problem of the state, the whole problem in general, is the bond of owing things. He goes all the way back to St. Paul to say we owe things in Christianity. We owe because a God died for us. It's impossible to pay that debt. So
Earlier than that, the original sin. Think about it.
yes, there's no way to pay that back.
Right.
But also in the Greeks, Diotima comes out and says in her definition of love that it's need or poverty meets resourcefulness. Again, a sense of debt or lack that D and G are trying to attack. They're trying to get rid of the sense of lack. And that's the point I wanted to make an hour ago.
No, that's reasonable. I'm sorry I didn't see your hand. You can always, yell at me. Yeah, okay, I see him now.
Michael!
I'm looking for the yellow. I'm fixated on the yellow. I once got a ticket in New Orleans, and I had a blind judge, literally a blind judge, and he kept flashing on the yellow line. But I'm seeing the yellow now, so I'm good. I've been flashing on the yellow line since I was found guilty because I couldn't show the picture to the blind judge, only in New Orleans. Josepha, please. Yeah.
This thing that Bruno brought up about the abstraction of the state.
Yeah.
I think you can see that in countries where the state has not been imposed itself, let's say, like mine, like Bolivia.
Yeah.
Because you have a weak state, and
right.
So which means that, for instance, only with the 2007 Constitution were the indigenous people able to enter into the Constitution, enter into the language of the state, but they brought their own language. So this made me think what we just read and what Bruno was saying, that so basically, if I look at the history of Bolivia, then the capitalist system actually did not really come all the way in until the early 20th century, and it was basically land-based oligarchy. So only when that comes about, I think that's what he means by it becomes concrete. That means it becomes part of the economic system.
Mm-hmm.
The in this case industrial, the mines, etc., and now in terms of the lithium, so the state really controls the natural resources in a way, and also the class the private property becomes. So I think so basically what Deleuze is talking about here is basically something that other countries are just living, that imposition. And and also in terms of the what you were saying about Nietzsche, Genealogy of Morals. It just made me think also that the in that essay, the sheep and the birds of prey. So you could see that that the what he says here, the material evolution of society. So if you think of the birds of prey as a natural way of eating the sheep, of catching the sheep,
Right.
so they're trying to make this look as bad and it's not good. So there's an imposition, let's say, on the material evolution of, in this case, the sheep or the animals, etc. The the concepts of good and evil.
Right.
So I think I don't know. That's how I see Nietzsche. I don't know if you see this connection with Nietzsche and the position of morals, which are superimposed. So I don't know I don't know if that's in the second essay of the genealogy.
It is in the origin. I think the reason and why I wanted to begin again with the second essay of the genealogy, it really is about the emergence of bad faith, bad conscience, right, etc., and also the foundation of Christianity in a way. Nietzsche's attack is really on Christianity. At the same time, we're looking at all the Judeo-Christian codes here that are overflowed and reconstituted in a sense, right? It's not only specific to Christianity, I mean, but it's, in that sense, right? This is why they go back to Abraham as well, in terms of the Urstaat, and then of course the Christian state, right? That we are constantly living under the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, to, look at Weber and many other books along these lines. How does this spiritual nature play out in a way? So I think what Nietzsche's really after here, and what really even more so, and one thing that attracts me about this book, is to break up the energy that gets bogged down in the creditor-debitor relationship, in the intense, relationships of to put it in Hegelian terms, master-slave, right, etc., and certainly in creditor-debtor relationships, to understand this so they can be transformed, and one does not live by ressentiment, by projection onto the other. It's all Donald Trump's fault. It's all George Bush's fault. It's all Barack Obama about affordable care, etc. These kind of categories for Nietzsche are just, in a way, they don't really have the power to undo. They're not intensive enough. The energy flow is being coded very quickly by, capital, or over-coded. And we live in this all the time, even in scholarship, where the tradition, everybody says the same thing, almost in different ways. So I think this is where they're trying to go. The genealogy of morals is really looking at this category that Deleuze, in his book, Nietzsche and Philosophy, and even earlier, Kloskowski's Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, on the concept of ressentiment. But for Nietzsche was not a socialist. He had no idea about trying to build the Paris Commune or build something different, or, etc. He was interested in a kind of new spiritual aristocracy. That has to be said.
A man with a mortgage is worth much more to a bank than a man who paid it off.
That's correct. Yes. And as Brecht once said, it's easier to rob a bank than it is to found one. And what Marx said about the Paris Commune, I'll just add to the banking thing, is that Marx said that the problem with the Paris, what you learn from, they didn't take the Bank of France. That was their problem. They didn't take the bank. So the Rothschilds pilled the plug and they called out the group of people. Yes, David, please. Yeah, I'm beginning to see hands, so thank you. I know we don't have this infantile yellow hand going up so much, but anyway, yeah, David, please. Yeah.
What I am trying to find in them, I don't know whether I'm just missing it or it's not in what we're reading, but as people who are really taking on Freud, it feels like in a Freudian narrative of all of this idea of debt, the debtor, the master, the slave, the indentured, there'd be more of a feeling of the absence or the presence of a kind of pleasure. perhaps not so specifically erotic even, but Freud wrote a lot about, in later years, the purified pleasure ego. The idea of saying part of pleasure is that you discharge tension, you don't have to think about anything. Clinically, it's why people with addictive disorders are so hard to treat, because there's often the sense of saying, all I can feel is pleasure if I did ecstasy or an opioid or something like that. Here, it feels like it's so much about only the social exchange without a feeling of either psychic process or erotic discharge. And I don't know whether that's kind of here as an absent presence in a Hegelian way, and I'm just maybe in more of the absence of it, but it comes in for them later.
Right.
If there may be an actual reason, this part of Freud that deals with libidinal organizations and territorialities seems sort of lacking, or something that they just aren't kind
Okay,
of
if you don't mind, I think we can address if we can hold your question or your, questioning, if you will, of this to when we go to the end of the chapter. I'm going to go there after Patrick's question, because I think they reply somewhat to you. So I'm going to try to use the text as replies. Yeah, go ahead, Patrick. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Good, good.
I come back to the kind of retrospective reconstruction,
Yeah.
which is characteristic of Marx and the Grundrisse,
Right.
when he talks about the importance of labor and the way in which they've kind of broadened Marx's analysis. And this is kind of like in response to Bruno's point about abstraction,
Right.
is that Marx has this whole analysis about abstract labor in terms of the logic of capital,
Right.
and how it basically operates. What they're doing here is, in a way, and this is, I'm speculating here, is
Yeah.
they're mapping a similar kind of logic onto the development of the state. And in a very similar way, because later on in the book, they talk about the abstract essence of desire in terms of libidinal desire. They're using the same kind, maybe not the same. Obviously, there is this anti-Hegelian element in Deleuze, but there is this kind of construction here that they're basically operating in terms of. So we don't read the history consecutively. When they talk about, suddenly out of nothing, this emerges, we don't know. What we do know is that, in fact, it did emerge. It does have these characteristics. It has this logic. And it's basically a mapping of the similar logic that exists within the abstraction of labor and the abstraction of libidinal desire. But here it's at the level of the state.
Yes, and the abstraction of the fetish too.
Yeah, same thing. This is, that's directly from Marx.
Going on as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
Make a great point. Bruno in his first book addresses some of these questions on abstract labor in his book called Labor of Fire. So we have someone here who knows abstract labor pretty well. So again, but yes, you bring up a great point. The logic of abstraction is something we don't do. In the United States, we're accustomed to having tangible something in front of us, right? We don't really move from the abstraction to the concretization. We don't really have that kind of movement going. Even in idealism, we don't have that going on, much less in materialism. This is not how, so yeah, Bruno, go ahead. Yeah, and then I want to go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I very much like
when he gets back. Yeah, please.
Like Patrick's point about labor, and I completely agree. But indeed, I think because you mentioned my work, Labor of Fire from 2005, but I say, abstract labor itself is not just an invention all of a sudden. It means that labor can become abstract. So there is this, so it is precisely mutatis mutandis, the same with the state or with desire, as Patrick says. And that's why I found very important.
Go ahead. Yeah,
very important the moment when they say that the original status that is the abstraction that is realized only as an abstraction. Here there is the whole Michael and Josh, we spoke so much about convergence, the convergence of a potentiality and actuality.
Yeah.
I mean, because it is a potential thing, but it is realized, but only as an abstraction. And it is, in a sense, the source might not be the right word, the source of all the concrete. I mean, the unity, right, that Marx then in the Grundrisse will speak about, I mean, of the diverse moments within the unit, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just to go back to abstract labor in the state, I mean, they read Kafka's Great Wall of China. They know not what they do. They build the wall, right? Who do they build the wall for, right, etc. This is a very great story that, really points to, I think, what they're trying to do. Where does this movement from the despotic to the abstract Urstaat happen? Why is the wall built, right, etc. This is interesting. And they use the metaphors of the material, the bricks, right, and the segments. They're always working on lines of segmentariness and also on the lines of where the bricks are. So you have both the wall and the brick in the wall working, to play on Pink Floyd, if you want to think of this way, you're chipping away at these bricks of the wall. And simultaneously, you have this temporality of segmentariness, right? You also have this, spatial relations of segmentary. So again, they're not looking really for origins. They're looking really, in Marxian sense, points of departure, new points of departure, in a way, not starting points, points of departure. I think, this is what I'm reading or gleaning here. I just want to go to the end for a second, just to address David's concerns again. I'm going to start again on page 265. It's the third to last paragraph of the entire section 3, vis-a-vis, in fact, I mean, I could go early. I'm sorry to read so much, but I think it's important, and maybe we'll have a good rhythm here. I'm going to go back to about 4 paragraphs earlier. I'm going to go to in the Minnesota text, it's page 268. I would think it's about 5. Yeah, it's about 5 paragraphs, 6 paragraphs before the end of section 3 and the end of Civilized Machine. And I'm going to start with the thing where we were last week a little bit. 4, and this again is with and against Lacan. For castration, in the order of the despotic signifier, as the law of the despot or the effect of the object from on high, is in reality the formal condition of the Oedipal images that will be deployed in the field of immanence left uncovered by the withdrawal of the signifier. I reach desire when I arrive at castration. What the desire castration, what does it signify, desire castration equation signify, if not in fact a prodigious operation that consists in replacing desire under the law of the despot, in introducing lack there at the deepest levels, and in rescuing us from Oedipus by means of a fantastic regression. This is a description of Lacanian practice and Lacan's, practice in general, right? A fantastic and brilliant regression. Someone had to do it. No one helped me, as Lacan said, to shake loose the yoke of Oedipus and carry it to the point of its auto-critique. But it is like the story of the resistance fighters who, wanting to destroy a pylon, balanced the plastic charges so well that the pylon blew up and fell back into its hole. From the symbolic to the imaginary, from castration to Oedipus, and from the despotic age to capitalism, inversely, there's the progress leading to the withdrawal of the overseen and overcoding object from on high, which gives way to the social field of immanence where the decoded flows produce images and level them down. Whence the 2 aspects of the signifier, a barred transcendental signifier taken in a maximum that distributes lack, and an immanent system of relations between minimal elements that come to fill the uncovered field, somewhat similar in traditional terms to the one that goes from the Parmenidean being to the atoms of Democritus. And Bruno, I can see you're flipping on the page. The next paragraph begins, a transcendent object is the beginning of the paragraph. Yeah, if you're on the page. I'm not hearing you. I'm sorry, you're muted. Yeah. But is everybody with me? It's at the end of the section, about 5 paragraphs back.
Yeah, but I didn't find the page. You said 268 and then
in the Minnesota book. Yeah.
Right, but then
in the middle of the page.
in the middle
I reach desire when I arrive at castration. But I want to read this because
You
I
have
think
the
it addresses
penguin.
some of David's concerns. Yes, Carl? What? I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just saying, in the Penguin book, the section you're reading is on 268.
Okay.
it is on 268. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm on 268 too. So
All right. Okay, thank you.
the Minnesota edition, unless I've missed the page number. No, it's 268. Okay. Okay. A transcendent object. This is very interesting. Again, going back to the whole
Oh, I see.
of money and debt, and something that I think Graeber could have learned from, that is more and more spiritualized for a field of forces that is more and more immanent, more and more internalized. This describes the evolution of the infinite debt through Catholicism, then the Reformation. The extreme spiritualization of the despotic state and the extreme internalization of the capitalist field define bad conscience, going back to the genealogy. The latter is not cynicism's contrary. It is in private persons the correlative of the cynicism of social persons. All the cynical tactics of bad conscience, just as Nietzsche, then D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller analyzed them to arrive at a definition of civilized European man. And this is great. The hypnosis and the reign of images, the torpor they spread, the hatred of life and all that is free, of all that passes and flows, the universal effusion of the death drive, depression and guilt used as a means of contagion, the kiss of the vampire. Aren't you ashamed to be happy? Follow my example. I won't let you go before you say, it's my fault. They're speaking to, the social therapies operated. Oh, ignoble contagion of the depressives, neurosis as the only illness consisting in making others ill. The permissive structure, let me deceive, rob, slaughter, kill, but in the name of the social order, and so daddy, mommy will be proud of me. The double direction given to ressentiment, the turning back against oneself and the projection against the other. The father is dead. It's my fault. Who killed him? It's your fault. It's the Jews. It's the Arabs. It's the Chinese. All the resources of racism and segregation, this abject desire to be loved, the whimperings at not being loved enough, at not being understood, quote unquote, concurrent with the reduction of sexuality to the dirty little secret, this whole priest psychology. There is not one single one of these tactics that is not found in Oedipus, its land of milk and honey, its good provider, nor is there a single one of these tactics that does not serve and develop in psychoanalysis, with the latter as the new avatar of the aesthetic ideal. Once again, psychoanalysis does not invent Oedipus. It merely provides the latter a last territoriality. Remember, we're moving from the savage through the despot to Oedipus at last, right? This is where they're going to end up. How did Oedipus coincide with the capitalist civilized machine? The couch, and a last law, the analyst as despot and money collector. But the mother is the simulacrum of territoriality, and the father is the simulacrum of the despotic law, with its slashed, split, castrated ego, are the products of capitalism insofar as it engineers an operation that has no equivalent in the other social formations. Everywhere else, the familial position is merely a stimulus to the investment of the social field by desire. The familial images function only by opening onto social images, to which they become coupled or which they confront in the course of struggles and compromises, so that what is invested through the breaks and segments of family is the economic, political, and cultural breaks of the field into which they are plunged. Compare the Dembu schizophrenia. This is the case given in the peripheral zones of capitalism, and they have mentioned Sami Amin. I don't know, most of you probably picked up on that earlier, the thinker of the periphery, etc., the against Eurocentrism, where the colonizers' efforts at Oedipalizing the indigenous population, African Oedipus, find themselves contradicted by the breakup of the family along the lines of social exploitation and oppression. I think this is what Joseph is speaking about to a degree in Bolivia. But it is at the end, it is at the soft center of capitalism in the temperate zones of the bourgeoisie that the colony becomes intimate and private, interior to each person. It is there that the flow of the investment of desire, which travels from the familial stimulus to the social organization or disorganization, as if it were covered over by a reflux that flattens the social investment into the familial investment, serving as a pseudo-organizer. The family has become the locus of retention and resonance of all the social determinations. It falls to the reactionary investment, important here, of the capitalist field to apply all the social images to the simulacra of the restricted family, with the result that wherever one turns, one no longer finds anything but father, another, mother, this edible filth that sticks to our skin. Yes, I desired my mother and wanted to kill my father, a single subject of enunciation, Oedipus, for all the capitalist statements, and between the two, the leveling cleavage of castration. I want to continue with this because I think this is a very interesting summation that we can work with. Marx said that Martin Luther's merit was to have determined the essence of religion, no longer on the side of the object, but as an interior religiosity. The birth of subjectivity is not Rene Descartes. It's basically Luther, I think, and people forget this. But anyway, that the merit of Adam Smith and Ricardo was to have determined the essence or nature of wealth, no longer as an objective nature, but again, here going back to Patrick, Bruno, and others, but as an abstract, deterritorialized subjective essence, the activity of production in general. But as this determination develops under the condition of capitalism, they objectify the essence all over again. They alienate and reterritorialize it, this time in the form of the private ownership of the means of production. So that capitalism is without doubt the universal of every society, but only insofar it is capable of carrying to a certain point its own critique. That is, the critique of the processes by which it re-enslaves what within it tends to free itself or to appear freely. Very interesting, right? The same thing may be said of Freud, and this is interesting back to David's point, right? His greatness lies in having determined the essence or nature of desire, no longer in relation to objects, aims, or even sources, territories. Bruno, they use the word source, territories, but as an abstract, subjective essence, libido or sexuality. But he still relates this essence to the family as the last territoriality of private man, whence the position of Oedipus, marginal at first in the 3 essays on infantile sexuality, by the way, then centering more and more around desire. It is though Freud were asking to be forgiven his profound discovery of sexuality by saying to us, at least it won't go any further than the family. The dirty little secret in place of all the wide open spaces glimpsed for a moment. The familialist reduction in place of the drift or of desire. In place of the great decoded flows, little streams recoded in mommy's bed. Interiority in place of a new relationship with the outside. We can go back to the schizoid on the walk, etc., off the couch. Throughout psychoanalysis, the discourse of bad conscience and guilt always rises up and finds its nourishment, what is called being cured. On 2 points, at least, Freud exonerates the real exterior family of any wrongs. The better to internalize the family and the wrongs in the person of his family's smallest member, i.e. the child. The way in which he posits an autonomous repression independent of social repression, the way in which he abandons the theme of the reduction of the child by the adult, seduction, of the child by the adult, in order to substitute the individual fantasy that makes the real parents into so many innocents or victims, even victims. For the family must appear in two forms. One where doubtless it is guilty, but only in the manner in which the child lives it intensely, internally, and where it is confounded with the child's own guilt. The other where it is a tribunal of responsibility, right? Before which one stands as a guilty child and in relation to which one becomes a responsible adult. Oedipus has sickness and sanity. Interesting phrase. The family is an alienating factor and as an agent of de-alienation, if only through the way in which it is reconstituted in the transference. This is what Foucault has shown in his very fine analysis. The familialism inherent in psychoanalysis doesn't so much destroy classical psychiatry as shine forth as the latter's crowning achievement. After the madman of the earth and the madman of the despot comes the madman of the family. What 19th century psychiatry had wanted to organize in the asylum, the imperative fiction of the family, reason the father, and madness the child or minor, the parents who are ill only from their own childhood, all this finds its fulfillment outside the asylum in psychoanalysis and in the consulting room of the analyst. Freud is the Luther and the Adam Smith of psychiatry. He mobilizes all the resources of myth, of tragedy, of dreams, pretty impressive, right? In order to re-enslave, interesting, re-enslave desire, this time from within an intimate theater, right? Yes, Oedipus is nevertheless the universal of desire, the product of universal history, but on one condition, which is not met by Freud, that Oedipus be capable, at least to a certain point, of conducting its auto-critique. Universal history is nothing more than a theology if it does not seize control of the conditions, and I like this, the conditions of the contingent's singular existence, right? Its irony and its own critique. And what are these conditions? This point where the auto-critique is possible and necessary. To discover beneath the familiar reduction the nature of the social investments of the unconscious. So they're beginning to provide some kind of movement now, in terms of the pragmatics of the schizoid analysis, to discover beneath the individual fantasy the nature of group fantasies. Oh, you like revolution too? That's good. We're on the right track here, right? Or what amounts to the same thing, to push the simulacrum to the point where it ceases to be the image of an image. So as to discover the abstract figures, the schizoid flows that it harbors and conceals, to substitute for the private subject of castration, split into a subject of enunciation and a subject of the statement relating only to the two orders of personal images, the collective agents of enunciation, for their part, refer to machinic arrangements, to overturn the theater of representation into the order of desiring production. This is the whole task of schizoid analysis. So I don't know, David, if this helps or confuses things more, but I think this is where they're going, full circle, if you will, in this part 3, right? And I love the phrase, Freud is both the Luther and the Adam Smith of psychiatry. Very interesting kind of relation here. The subjective, the birth of subjectivity, and of course, the wealth of nations, and, kind of the first one that said that labor is the source of value. So interesting to me. But please, David, I want to hear from you. I moved here so we can, you know, kind of put this in perspective from the Freudian narrative. Yeah. Yeah.
This is actually very, very helpful. Thank you, Michael. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
Yeah.
But what I was still left with is
Okay.
feels like libido does work in Freudian theory in a variety of ways. You know, one, your body is filled with sexual tension and energy, and so the orgasm is pleasurable because you reduce the tension. In a way, the sexual energy has an epistomophilic impulse where there's a way of saying, oh my God, my body needed that, and now I might understand through it its relationships to multiplicities of other bodies or social orders, or I might understand why my culture presents me with images of Marilyn Monroe standing on a subway grating with her skirt blowing up in the air. I might understand why in a movie like The Sound of Music, Maria von Trapp kind of seems a little calmer, you know, when she comes back from her honeymoon. Like there's a way of understanding like the adult
Yeah.
world a little more.
Right.
So here, the part that I get is it just feels like even in this, these guys are really not discussing the idea of there's something pleasurable in a variety of ways about the Oedipal. You know, it's gratifying if you sleep with your mother. I mean, you can't, you shouldn't, it would be a bad thing, but it would be a kind of a pleasure. There might also be, in a way I don't know that this theory takes it in, the great pleasure of the concreteness of saying, my God, there's so much abstraction, and at times that's overwhelming, but if I could just say concretely for a moment, you know, I bought a mutual fund and it made a 20% return. Oh my God, I'm just happy as a clam. You know, obviously that's not dealing with angst or anything, but there's a certain kind of pacification, obviously, the middle class has with the idea whether they're getting a Roth IRA, with saying there's less existential dread if you feel, you know,
Yeah.
you've got the right stuff in the bank.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't know for them if in their strange dialectic of sort of critiquing the Oedipus because it feels like it creates a kind of psychosocial stasis. You know, nothing can move. It's the critical thing in capitalism that's blocking it all up, but it's also been created by capitalism to maintain this kind of strange status quo. If they see the seduction or the pull that it has. So without going, you know, too far away from them, for those of you who are art lovers, one of the people who got really big in the past 20 years was the Sigmar Polke in the School of Capitalist Realism. And his paintings, again, I don't want to go too far afield, but kind of why they got a lot of attention is unlike, say, Roy Lichtenstein, which was just purely like this kind of dry cartoon, you could feel the beauty of someone who grew up in post-World War II deprivation in Germany, who would paint pictures of sausages, you know, that looked glossy and full, like images you'd see in magazines, but then would be covered over with cerebral ideas of Marxist tropes like high fashion is much too expensive, or something that would get you to think cortically about this experience which had sucked you in. I don't know that it's their part of their enterprise, but I kind of feel they don't seem to understand sexuality in these more nuanced, fully embodied ways as part of what's constituting the Oedipal. It feels like almost if we were to analyze them, they're just so, I mean, they're intellectuals, but they're so highly, highly intellectualized, it's missing something of the actual body. In a way, other philosophers like Bergson, Frederick Jameson, Lacan, in a way, for sure, Nietzsche, seem to grasp the power of embodiment a bit more completely. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a provocative, you know, interpretation here. But again, I just want to emphasize, I think they go through these steps in a way where they then equate, you know, the guy with the mutual fund, you know, early on, you know, they go into the anality that becomes the new moment in this transition from the despotic to civilized, right? The anality of capitalism, and that they want to, you know, again, get away from that. There are many levels. Again, I mean, I think they anticipate some of what you say. On the other hand, I mean, you have a very good point. I'm not so sure, you know, how much of, you know, again, I find them to have a tremendous respect for Freud. I don't think they're really just trying to dismiss Freud, or they're using Freud as a straw man. I think they're trying to show Freud, in this time, right, in a way that what is being left out, in a sense, and what psychoanalysis did not have in its even best of worlds was a theory of social repression. They're trying in some ways to retrieve the Reichian moment, right? To retrieve this and put the body back center stage instead of just laying on the couch with the free associations and the reorganization and rethinking and rewriting of the narrative. I think this is what they're really trying to do. And they see again in the schizoid, as we mentioned last week, and going back to this notion of limit, the limit is really the schizoid is the schizophrenia is the absolute limit of where we are. This is what they're trying to show. This is how it's come to be. It is not a disease of the broken soul, right? in the ancients, right? The ancients had a notion of destiny, the amor fati. We're the ones seeing these symptoms now, right? In this advanced capital stage. So again, I think they're trying to work with this as much as possible. I think the body's very much present through this. I know it's the slogan is the body without organs, but I think they're trying to go back to this, again, there are many levels of abstraction that are happening here. The body is Earth. Right? It is Earth, right? Yeah. It's beyond, again, the construction of the daddy, mommy, me, triangulation that they consistently are creating. So anyway, yeah, Carl, go ahead. We'll go. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry I jumped to the end, but I think it's good, again, in the spirit of what Patrick was saying, that you somehow retrospectively begin to put this into a framework that can kind of give it more to work with. Yeah, Carl. Yeah, you're on mute, Carl. Yeah.
I was just saying, I really appreciate what you said, David. I mean, that's much richer than I could do justice to. But I guess I've been sort of developing the same feeling about this, and in terms of like this category of desiring production, which in some sense seems so abstract and generic. And when David was talking about, sort of the specificity of the pleasure, one of the things that sort of seemed to me, I think what you're getting at, David, is that, the libidinal cathexis is not really operating in a certain way in their framework, because as I understand it, that libidinal cathexis is always very concrete. It's very specific. If I like with a perversion, I think would be another interesting example. Like when you have a sort of an obsessive fixation on something, it's that thing. I mean, it may be a symbol of something more general, but it just seems like there's a concrete specificity that is lacking in all this. I don't know if this makes sense, but then the other thing, I guess I just also feel a little bit like in the section that we sort of skipped over, where they're really reworking some of the themes in Marx, is that there isn't really a sense of labor, the body in production. Like to me, that was kind of absent in a lot of, there's flows, there's conjunctions, there's deterritorializations, there's money, there's these axiomatic, coding.
Well, they're not especially. I mean, it begins with what a problem, and they end here in part 3. Once again, if you remember at the beginning, what a mistake to call it the id. It shits, it fucks, it does this, it does that. Why not call it the it? Obviously, as a reference to George Groddick's, great book, The Book of the It, right? that he did. That Freud defends Groddick in Future of an Illusion. Right, basically, Future of an Illusion is a defense of the unconscious. Yeah, but listen to me for a second. They go back around and they say what they're interested in is the factory. That this is really what we're doing, and also there is a libidinal Marx at work here. This is not really about de-libidinizing or taking away the body from labor or whatever. There's a kind of libidinalization of Marx that's happening here as well as bringing in again the section of social repression. I mean, Wilhelm Reich. I have some issues with Reich? Of course, I think we all do. But in a way, Reich was the one who brought the body to the fore. He said the body does not lie. He is the one that does this. I mean, in the mass psychology, character analysis, he also has a great thing about overcoming servitude. It's a little pamphlet, Listen, Little Man, that he wrote to the workers in here. So I think they have all this in here. I don't think they're giving us specific examples. They're not trying to rewrite capital here. They're not trying to say this is the working day, or this is, these are the schemes of reproduction. They're trying to give us a schematization of how we're going to get to the capitalism is the relative limit of our times, whereas schizophrenia, the broken soul in Greek, the phrenos of the schizoid, the split soul, the broken soul, is the absolute limit of the thing. Yes, David Winters.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just, I thought I'd draw attention to where they talk about labor a little bit, the production of surplus value. And one of the reasons that they don't necessarily talk about labor in the way that I think we sort of expect labor to be talked about, and what they do instead is the introduction of machinic surplus value.
Right.
And in the middle of the page on 237, I'll just read a little bit of the beginning of that paragraph, that the definition of surplus value must be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital, which distinguishes itself from the human surplus value of variable capital and from the non-measurable nature of this aggregate of surplus value of flux. So, to say that what we have to introduce into sort of a Marxian theory is that constant capital is productive of surplus value, the way that orthodox Marxism reads only like human labor power to be like potentially productive of surplus value, is a real departure, I think, from like the human body as center of value production within capitalism. So they're clearly, I mean, they're making a real turn away from value defined that way, which is, becomes really important, by the way, in media studies, and the way we then try to conceive of like how media apparatuses participate in the production of value in like the digital consumer economy, but then digital economy. This is one of the departures that kind of media theory takes from Deleuze and Guattari, I think, and the autonomists as well, right, to some degree.
As well as Debord, the production of images. How does the world become an agglomeration of images? And they talk about this here. They don't cite Debord, they don't get into it, but it's there. It's already there, in many ways, right? They're very aware of the society of the spectacle and the further commentaries on the society of the spectacle. So it's not only, I mean, and in some ways, if you think about this section that David pointed to, this is a reading of the Grundrisse. The Form 8 definition must be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital. And this is where Marx is sketching out constant and variable capital in the first sense. And I think if we bring in a humanist reading of this, we're really missing something. This is not about humanism. This is a text on, for, and about desire, if you will. Yeah. It's a long meditation on that. What is desire, right? Whether they answer the question or not, whether it's done metaphysically is another story. Whether schizoid analysis will give us insight is another story. Yes, Carl, and then Bruno. Yeah, sorry to.
Well, I think this gets into very complicated issues. I actually like what they're doing. The criticisms I have just to, it's more where I see maybe they're coming up against their own limits, which I think is kind of what David is maybe getting at also. But I mean, the issue of machinic surplus value, I think that's the way they use that is a mistake, actually.
Okay.
And the two things. It's not to say, I mean, Marx's theory of value and surplus value may or may not be true. It's not to sort of reassert that Marx got it right, but there is actually in Marx an absolute limit interior to capital, and that appears in that section of the Grundrisse.
He was wrong.
And it appears in a different way in the theory of the falling rate of profit. There is.
Yes.
there is actually a very concrete, this isn't just an abstraction. The machinic surplus value, I think what they're talking about is what in the field of economics and political economy is sort of this dichotomy between a physical measure of surplus and a labor time measure of surplus, which gets into a whole other direction that I think is kind of outside of what we're doing. But I think that they confound two very different measures. And in doing that, there's a whole problem in terms of which measure is more important, which regulates all these types of things. But but again, I think that the reference to the Grundrisse is a good one here in the sense that in their framework, technical machines attached to the body without organs, but people are almost peripheral. The subject is kind of this nomadic thing that is adrift. And in that sense, I think there is a displacement of the centrality of labor and the role of money and value as a theory of how the allocation of social labor time takes place, which gets us more into kind of, I think, the substance meat of capital, right? Socially necessary labor, all these things that in Marx, he spends a lot of time. But I just see them as almost displacing all that. And I think that, again, it becomes a kind of abstraction, that it lacks the concrete mediation, which I think is kind of what David is getting at with desire, and that we could, in some sense, improve what they're doing by, I see these as sort of limits, not strengths in the analysis.
Okay, well, we'll keep that in mind, mediation as a category in that problem in terms of fleshing this out in a more, maybe fuller way. And that could be good. I mean, in many ways. But again, they're not interested in the old style mediations. They don't have any piety here in terms of taking back. They're really developing a new theoretical landscape in a sense, right? Yeah, Bruno, please. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't find the passage where David was reading from, but something related to that as well I was going to mention.
Well, it's page 237.
Oh,
and it begins, the definition of surplus value must be modified, right?
Okay, yes, I see now, yes, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, but okay, good, because it relates to this, but I wanted to go back to the last, the pages that you read earlier, Michael, on Freud, actually, but there is there too, on page 270, a link in the text on the page itself between Marx and then Freud, and the question of precisely the end note 101 is a reference to Marx, again, the Grundrisse. And, it's interesting, then they go into precisely Freud, the same thing must be said of Freud. And then the question of the abstract character, again, of the abstract character of a desire. The essence of desire, right? And then that they go on with that on the next. But that's again what Patrick was saying before. I mean, labor, the state, desire, same. In a sense, there is the same form or whatever trajectory, and in all these situations, we have this attempt at re-enslaving, right? What is free, what could be free, which is then what in 1000 Plateau will become the question of capture, right? This re-enslaving, from which the schizo, I mean, that's the task, they say, at the end of schizoanalysis, right? To exit this theater of representation. The schiz is the line of flight out of this constant ways of re-enslaving. And that's the question, because they say clearly also Freud, right? I mean, he does everything in order then to re-enslave desire, this time from within an intimate theater. And if I may add one thing, I don't know if everybody here has seen Theorema, and here Michael and others know that I have problems, right, with that movie, but I was reconsidering, I mean, if you think of it, Theorema, that probably Pasolini made that movie before, this
Yeah.
book, not was written, but it's really the exploding of the Oedipal model, right? I mean, it's no longer kept. It cannot longer be kept within the family because the desire comes from the outside, and it is almost like an Urstadt kind of.
It is. The
Yeah.
Urstadt is Terence Stamp, the character. Those of you that have
Exactly.
wonderful performance by Terence Stamp, as well as many of the Italian actors in there, including what's her name, Silvano
Mangano.
right. But extraordinary
Yeah, yeah.
performance was worth seeing. And I think you're right, Bruno, in a
Yeah.
way, the exterior devil, if you will, right? The one
Yeah.
Lucifer who brings light, but also brings sexuality back into the house itself, right? Is in
And
a way the
if I
forbidden fruit that starts operating within the household from
right,
every class within the house, the maid, the
yeah,
the
exactly.
servant, the wife, the husband, the son, and the daughter, right? And it's a
Yeah.
breakup exactly of this intimate familialism. Yeah, please go ahead.
And he does so all the time in each instance, right? He relates equally, in a sense, indifferently to all members in the household and outside of the grotesque triangulation that they speak about. They use the term grotesque. So that's
Yeah, let me just, I mean, forgive me. I'm reading from notes from many years ago, so forgive me in a sense. I was maybe smarter then, but anyway, Marx described this is the thing that capitalism is the conjunction of all decoded and deterritorialized flows. That's the conjunctive synthesis in terms of the definition. To understand this, even if the conjunction is to be primary, we have to begin with deterritorialization and decoding of flows. This is exactly what Marx described as the process of originary accumulation, right? Which is the historical production of the conditions necessary for capitalist production. The most important, which is the creation of the proletariat, a free labor force. Free. Marx uses this language, by the way. The central operation in the process of original accumulation in English history, which Marx focuses on, is the clearing of the estates in which the peasants were swept off the land, forced to congregate or gather eventually in the new industrial cities. What we're seeing in China today, we see another repetition of this in terms of the building of the cities, and the agricultural economy becoming much more of urban dwelling and the problems that that's going to bring in the way. All right, so they're no longer, the workers were freed from the land, or in better sense, really freed from the means of production in a double sense. They're no longer considered part of the means of production, as were serfs or slaves, right? And you can think of the American slaves this way. The factory system needed the Civil War. Really needed the Civil War for workers to come north. How many jobs were created? We can talk about that more. And they no longer possessed any means of production. Marx called, going back to what Bruno said, called this freedom Vogelfrei, right? Bird free. Free as a bird, whatever that means. Yeah, but that's his term. I'm getting this from the German of account. This was precisely the process of deterritorialization and as decoding in the sense that also all forms of value, prestige, your title, etc., are brought down to the level of the universal equivalent. Carl can relate here, the level of money to the cash nexus. That's from the manifesto. The establishment of money as the universal equivalent involves the decoding of all other schemes of value. Yeah, so decoding and deterritorialization are part of the movement of capitalism on this plane of immanence, how it starts to work with this universal. I won't go on, but anyway, I think this is important to remember, that they're not only talking about exploitation of labor, they're also talking about the movements of labor, right, as well, and how this then becomes recoded or overcoded, right? Capitalism itself is an operation of decoding. Look, take the example of organic food, right? We all grew, some of us in this room, a few of Josh and Tony and Justin and a few other people, but a lot of us remember, after the 60s, organic food, right? What has organic food morphed into? How has capitalism worked? Look at the amazing amount of business that Whole Foods, Amazon does today, right? It overcoded something that was considered an alternative, right? Yeah, in many ways. How does this work constantly and constantly? I think they're doing something very, very critical for our conjuncture. How will the new normal, how will capital overcode during this pandemic, right? To create new forms of enslavement, new forms of subjection, etc. I think this is very important to keep in mind. And how does this work in terms of libidinal investment, right, if you will, and what's happening in the side, and how do people get to believe this? It's just like Joe Biden. He's a relief, but 50 years, as Jeremy Scahill has pointed out, I didn't need to read Jeremy Scahill to hear this, but Jeremy Scahill has a new piece out on what a warmonger this guy is. And all of a sudden, the US people think this is such a relief, right, from Trump, and this doesn't have to do with the warfare state that we live under and all of its levels, right? Nobody has said anything about the connection to Raytheon with the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and what that could mean in terms of the new buildup against our two main enemies, which are both Cold War enemies, China on the one hand, for them daring to catch up with us in terms of technology, whether they have or not is another story. And then secondly, of course, Russia, that has better missiles or is starting to develop more intercontinental ballistic missiles. Yeah, Carl, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Just, another thing that I've been thinking about in terms of reading, particularly this section is, I think that I don't know if I would think of the axiomatic that they talk about as decoding. It seems to me it's better to think about capitalism as
overcoding, not decoding. They're overcoding. Capitalism overcodes.
But is it your sense that the overcoding becomes that operates primarily through the state and the family, not through money? I mean, it seems like money is what decodes in them. It's the flows. It's taking what's concrete and embedded in families and kinships and other systems that are very concrete and specific, even if, but, and it's sort of, there's always this, capitalism is the limit of all these prior forms, right? They're constantly being threatened by the decoding. So capitalism emerges out of a decoding. And I guess it seems to me that even within the production of money and monetary forms as they've evolved, that it's actually it certainly deterritorializes. It separates people, like you were just saying. What you read yourself was, a good way of saying that. But it seems like modern finance is actually the production of new codings, the production of it works within this kind of what they call an abstract axiomatic. But it's actually
being someone that studied this, that the year that Freud writes The Interpretation of Dreams, Louis Bachelet, a French mathematician, writes a book called The Theory of Speculation.
Yes.
This is 120 years ago that this book is published. Same year Nietzsche dies, Husserl writes The Logical Investigations, and Freud's Interpretation of Dreams is published.
Right.
Theory of mathematical finance is born, right in my way. That's playing out today. And I'm not so sure that we've gone any further than that. When you think about the language of the universal equivalent, in finance, derivatives, special project purpose acquisition companies, right? All of these things that are going on are part and parcel of something that goes back into the speculation and into, a kind of reworking of what capital needs for financialization at a particular time and how the mathematics, works on this. As most of you know, the Treviso arithmetic is absolutely crucial for the development of capitalism. The new multiplication tables, no longer the other thing. So one way of dating capitalism in terms of a very material invention would be 1484 from Italy. You know, the guys, the merchants start figuring out new mathematical tables. You know, Leibniz, the differential calculus on which statistical approaches for life insurance, annuities are all based on, right? So that the mathematical is historically, again, constructed as well. So I'm not so sure that, you know, I mean, I think axiomatics is very important. Again, what they're going to try to do is produce an axiomatic around, again, their limit. I want us to keep this in mind. I'm not saying I agree with this fully or I'm trying to advocate for them, but for at least us to understand that the schizophrenia is the absolute limit. Capitalism is the relative limit, right? You know, yeah, in a way, it's the end, capitalism. Schizoid phrenia as the absolute limit of all this is the new beginning for them, if you will. Okay, so this is very important to keep in mind as we go forward in more of the narratological sense, right? So Bruno, please, yeah, sorry.
I think it's also what Carl, you were saying is that the question of money, precisely money as capital, right? Not simply money as money. So the formula M prime, which is
transformation problem.
The transformation, right? Because that's what then a surplus value, no?
Right.
Is therefore, which is simply an extension of a value, as many like Antonio Negri says in the book on Marx, I believe, Marx Beyond Marx, but it is. But in any case, the idea is in the Grundrisse, Marx speaks of this spiral kind of movement, right? And so it is precisely because of the limits. And it is in the character of capital to always try to not break and go beyond its own limits, its own barriers. But it doesn't do it in any way, in a spiraling, if I can say, way. So that's very interesting in the context of what we are reading, no? And of course, even in the age of financialization that then you also can refer to, but there too, and actually Lazzarato, no, Maurizio Lazzarato says that in his book on the making of an indebted man, how the formula M prime, money that becomes more money, right, which is the formula for capital, is there too. I mean, it's there because Marx speaks of it, during the time of the specificity of capital, which is industrial capital, and today as well. So it is.
In that case, it would be Amsterdam capital.
Yeah, right.
1605 is the birth of the stock exchange in Amsterdam. Yeah. But anyway.
Okay, so no, that's just, I just wanted to add this remark. And,
Yes, David, yes, please, yeah.
I wanted to just partly say to the group that a little shout out for Bruno, because I recently downloaded his book and it's just wonderful. And he's, I think, a bit modest about it, but it's very well done. So, thank you, Bruno. It's a great read. And Carl, I was really connecting with what you were saying. Like, it really helped me to kind of consolidate my ideas. Thank you. Michael, what I was thinking in this is, you were saying how with capitalism, there's kind of the problem of overcoding, which, in going back to their engagement with Freud, at the bottom of 270, there's a part where they say this. On 2 points at least, Freud exonerates the real exterior family of any wrongs, the better to internalize the family and the wrongs in the person of the family's smallest member, the child. The way in which he posits an autonomous repression independent of social repression, the way in which he abandons the theme of the seduction of the child by the adult in order to substitute the individual fantasy that makes the real parents into so many innocents or even victims. And then there's a little footnote to Erich Fromm, who was very critical of Freud's reworking of the case of little Hans, and looked at the idea of him as being kind of, quotes, guilty because he had these incestuous fantasies. In this, do you feel like their kind of problem, such as it is with Freud, is they see him as having this interesting system that ideally is going to take apart your mind and your unconscious fantasy, and it could maybe just liberate you? The earlier Freud seemed more optimistic about that. But then it's kind of twisted because it becomes a kind of an overcoating, like a betrayal of sorts, because you're on the couch, you're free associating, but ultimately it's you, the neurotic, who are at fault because you were bad and you had these guilty fantasies, and Freud is not going to let you off the hook, but he's sort of overcoating you in the way they see it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the whole question of owning up, right? Or owning something about yourself, right? I mean, in a sense, and taking responsibility for, again, the fantasy or the project, whatever goes on, in your own analysis, etc. Again, I don't think they're, again, dismissive of Freud. They're trying to put him again in this context of, what they consider. Remember the subtitle of the book, uh, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. That Freud represents,
Uh-huh.
at one level, the last, an eschatology, if you will, right,
Uh-huh.
of where capitalism has ended up, right, and that they're looking, and it's brilliant, right? It's magnificent. It's a poetic tour de force, and all of these things. But again, it is not enough for the moment to be able to understand his desire ultimately revolutionary at bottom, right?
Mhm.
Or is it fascistic? These are really the questions I think that they're posing, which to my mind is extremely radical, right? In a way. I mean,
Right.
we see how desire, and I mean, I know Carl's one of his professors has written a book called The Production of Desire. Again, I mean, yes, it is produced, et cetera. Where are we with this at this point, right? In some ways, and again, they want to get out of. I know Freud just didn't say it's always daddy, mommy, me. He would not do that. But
Mhm.
what they're seeing here in terms of the practice and what they're seeing, in Guattari's clinical, studies in the asylum, right? And in Laborde Clinic, which was a very experimental group. What he learned in the Lacanian school and all of this is that there's some moment where it comes back to the structure of castration and lack and the death
Mhm.
drive. And these are things that they find to still be somewhat, not applicable, right, in their attempt to go to this new conjunctive synthesis, right, that will open up this new positivity, if you will, on the other side of the dialect, the engagement with schizoid analysis. So this,
Did they?
yeah, but go ahead. I'm
Oh,
listening. Yeah.
no, in that way, did they at all engage in the concept of the Nachträglichkeit?
Of deferred activity.
Yes, because I
Uh,
always have felt that's one of Freud's more brilliant and more
and
complicated
certainly
ideas.
very important for Derrida and your friend Alan Bass. I mean, very
Right.
important, la différence, right? That comes out of that concept. We're always in the delayed, the deferral, right? We like to call it procrastination, but it's much deeper than that,
Uh,
right? In some
right.
ways,
But
yes. But no, they
yeah.
did not go into that level. No, no, they were not they were not engaged in that kind of language. The Lacanians were, in very good senses, Jean Lablanche and
Uh,
Pontalis and
mhm.
Serge Leclerc, and a person I love. If you're interested in psychoanalysis and a good overview of the Lacanian, Mustafa Safwan, the Egyptian psychoanalysis, very accessible. The book called Four Lessons of Psychoanalysis. Very, very brilliant work here.
How,
Very open. Yeah.
how do you spell his last name?
Safouan, Mustafa. Yeah. Let me see. I have the book here. I can tell you. Yeah. This is
Thank
close.
you.
I don't have to go to two different rooms. I think. I mean, I may not. Yeah, it's called Four Lessons of Psychoanalysis. Safouan, Mustafa. It was one of Lacan's favorite Egyptian.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is the book, and he goes through the lessons, and he very, very interesting work. And his best book, in my opinion, no, I'm just kidding. This is more of a clinical book, but one of his best, Why the Arabs are Not Free: The Politics of Writing. It's a very
Interesting.
beautiful book. that takes its point of departure from psychoanalysis. So I'm not, listen, I have a beautiful original photograph. Josh has seen it, Bruno has seen it, of Freud in his study in the Viennese period. So, I'm not, and I think that both of them are very respectful. At times they may be like children and they're snapping a little too much, right? At the person that went into the deepest recesses of the mind. And obviously it was the archaeologist par excellence, well before Michel Foucault and all of that. But again, I think they're trying to situate this. If we can keep this in mind, they're trying to libidinalize Marx's approach. And they're doing so through a Nietzschean way of looking at things, right? They really buy the fact that Freud was somewhat tongue-in-cheek when he said, I did not read Nietzsche because he symbolized a nobility to which I could not attain. Now, we all know he had to have read the Genealogy or some of this stuff, and of course, Lou Andrea Salome, who was Nietzsche's muse and object of desire, was with Freud for, many years, who he was tremendously fond of. So anyway, so the Nietzschean aspect here of the genealogy, and certainly the gay science, the joyful wisdom is another way of translating that. But the happy science, if you will, is another book that they're really looking at as well. Yeah. So I think this is another thing that they have this aphoristic style too. They're trying to, in their way, code through aphorisms, right? To get outside. They're actually playing the role of the schizoid that's fully conscious, right? In some way.
Right. It's a strange paradox. But Michael, I'm curious in this way about Nachdenklichkeit, in that my understanding of Marx, which is, hazy and it's from a long time ago, being an undergraduate, is that in inheriting what he did from Hegel, the proletariat will liberate itself if it becomes aware of the concept of history and how it got there and what happened, and that's a potential force of liberation. And it feels like by understanding in an analysis deferred action, there is a way of moving back to the original Traum, which is sort of more than the mind can bear, to say, I could really see or understand my history now in this different way that it's revealed to me, which theoretically would set the neurotic free. In their system, it feels like somehow, and again, I may just not be getting them, or we're still in the middle of it all, it doesn't quite feel like there's a way out. Like it feels like this is what is. We're in the world of schizanalysis, but I don't know for them.
That's their way out. To put it in your terms, their way out will be the task of schizoid analysis, and then 8 years later, thinking through plateaus in terms of everything from linguistics to the war machine, of which Maurice Lazzarato was a student of Deleuze and a friend of Guattari as well. Bruno mentioned The Case of Indebted Man and other works. Has just written a book with Eric Ariès, a very good student of Deleuze, called Wars and Revolution, a new book that's out, Wars and Capital, I'm sorry. Yeah. So anyway, yes, you bring up a great point. And it's crucial to an understanding of Freud. We all live in this world of deferred action, right? We all live. I mean, it's that, this is what writing is about, right? In a sense, right? The deferred activity, in a sense. And if you think of Marcel Proust, what was Proust's great ambition was to kill time through writing. Remember the things past, in search of lost time, was really a way of recapturing time, to kill time itself, right? This is quite an ambitious project, but the deferred action got to him. He did finish it, right? Yeah, anyway, so that's something. Yeah, Carl, please, yeah.
So, I was just going to, two things. I mean, I think that that it is important to, I think in the last section of the book, we're going to come back to a more sustained engagement with psychoanalysis and Freud and schizoanalysis. And in my readings, like I was looking at the interpretation of dreams this week, and there's this extremely rich whether it's accurate in all its details or not, but this sort of the term you used, Michael, the archaeology of the unconscious, and
Right.
looking also at its mechanisms. I mean, Freud is trying to understand it or
Absolutely.
identify through actual clinical observation the way in which this very complex psychic these operations take place. And it seems that there may be in what you're saying, their refusal of mediation might actually end up impoverishing the ability to essentially incorporate what's positive about Freud, what was opened up in terms of his discoveries. And I feel like we're kind of finally to the point where they're either going to deliver on what I think that they've sort of been building up to, that they're actually going to show that there is this
Okay.
other way of theorizing the unconscious and desire and how it mediates the social and how it reproduces the social, or they're not. And I think that actually in Freud,
Right.
there's a lot of ways you can look at what he's doing when he's reconstructing dreams. That it may not have been his context, but the social is present in Freud constantly. I mean, that it's
Oh,
always,
yeah, sure.
it's always there. And I think that that there's a little bit of, again, of a dichotomization that might not capture, I think, maybe kind of what David's getting at. Some of the the nuances or the complexities that
Yeah,
are
I'd just like to say this about their endeavor. I don't think either of them really believed that psychoanalysis was, socially, I mean, it was relevant as a study. Its contribution was massive and all of that. But these are people that are now looking at the surface. They're not interested in dredging up unconscious because the clientele was no longer there, right? Or the capitalism had reached a point where no longer is it valuable to their way of thinking in terms of revolutionary practice. They both consider themselves revolutionaries here. I want to just be clear about this. So in some ways, and they both understood, very well. I think, look, Guattari was analyzed by Lacan, right? He had a relationship. He knew the language. He knew the vocabulary. He had his own ways of, dealing with his own transferential, counter-transferential problems in some ways. Deleuze, as we all know, is a first-rate philosopher who actually was, I think, trained as a psychoanalyst. I don't think he ever practiced, but this was, again, someone where, the filmmakers of the period, Chantal Akerman, Wim Wenders, these were all friends of his. They went to see Gilles Deleuze, right, in Paris. So there was a very, very different moment in time. Again, I mean, it would be nice we do the show the 70s, right, in a sense, up until 1980 till the plateaus came, right, in a sense. But anyway, the idea, again, here is you're absolutely right. I mean, Freud dared to go to the depths where no one went. And he paid a great price for it. He was ostracized by many. He was ostracized by, called the godless Jew by the community. Like Hannah Arendt was, ostracized by the New York, intellectual community. How dare you say Eichmann was only following orders? Freud, how dare you say it's all comes down to, libido and, et cetera, and repression, et cetera. So yeah, I mean,
so Mike, this is a question.
so again, think about this, that you're having an opening of something that's very different during this period. It's again a reflection on May of '68, all power to the imagination. They're trying to roll with that, if you will, right? And really trying to pick up on, what the future possibilities were. And this is also aimed towards institutional practices. This is a critique of institutional psychotherapy and institutional, institutionalization of many people, right? Right? Yeah.
So, well, this is kind of a quite. I like the way you put it, because this is sort of my reading too, is that they're not interested in the depths; they're interested in the surface, right? That's kind of where they're going. And I guess another way to sort of get at what I'm saying is that I don't know that in the end we gained so much from that move. I mean, I think that was a more general move that happened in what we have, post-structuralism, or with a variety of
They,
things.
they weren't structuralists or post-structuralists.
Right,
They're
but
different,
certainly, like,
traditions. Yeah.
this idea of, again, essence, appearance, like in both Marx and in both Freud, in very different ways, but you have sort of the underlying essential structures, essential relations, and then a whole set of processes, mediations, not in the Hegelian sense, but
Right.
that transform those into the phenomenon, and then the work
Sure.
of science is to
Sure.
take the phenomenon and transform them back into the underlying structure. And that, to me,
Right.
I guess that I personally
Right.
remain committed to that as a basic methodology. I think that
Um,
we lose more
Right.
for giving that up. And I think that we now have to, look back at 50 years, 60 years and say, what has been the real gain in terms of,
Well, I don't think they ever had their day in the sun, to be honest.
yeah,
These
well,
people.
you know,
They
that's
had a certain following, but they never were, their day in the sun at all.
Yeah.
We have very different very different set of practices here. Again, going back to this distinction between appearance and reality, which is in, of course, Plato, appearance and essence, as we talk in the Marxist tradition, manifest, latent, all of these things. To Nietzsche, again, the Greeks were so profound in the appearance, right? This is the surface to Nietzsche. The beauty was on the surface, right? Always. This is really, really where it was happening. He didn't believe, if you will, or subscribe to the fact that there was something, much more deeper than the appearances. So in a way, they are speaking again with their allegiance, if you will, or their connection to a Nietzschean view of things, right? Going forward. Yeah. Anyways. And I don't know. I mean, again, I agree. I mean, I like processes. I like uncovering rocks and leaving no stones unturned. But at the same time, if you look at this in the last 50 years, what are we dealing with out here, right? Are they so wrong about the absolute limit at this point? I mean, look what's coming down. Yeah. We don't have any conversation about Freud anymore. We don't have any conversation, very much taken out of clinical programs, right? These guys are, this would be considered an atom bomb, in psychology departments, or in, even forbidden
Yeah.
some institute. So, I mean, I think we have to be careful here. Is this giving us what Althusser would call the symptomatic reading that we need? Right, in a certain way. And you're right. Are they going to deliver on their promise? But doesn't it really show you a lot of symptoms, maybe what went wrong in the tradition? I'm always interested. Why does Freud, criticize Ferenczi? Why does Freud destroy Jung? Right? What is really going on? Why all of these internecine things, right, that go on in psychoanalysis? And I think they're pointing this out, just as they point out the same things in the Russian Revolution. When did it all start going bad? In the Second International, with Stalin, with this or whatever, they asked some good questions here. And I mean, speaking of which, they have a great section on Lenin and the revolution. This is on page 252, right? Where they talk about the Russian Revolution. This situation, I mean, they're talking about monopoly capital at work, and in the time of the revolution. It's page 253. My mistake. I'm sorry. I don't have bad light. Anyway, I'll read from the beginning. The capitalist state, then the Urstate, right? This is a distinction they make. So this is a good point to read from, right? Is in a different situation. It is produced by the conjunction of a decoded or deterritorialized flows, and is able to carry the becoming immanent to its highest point only to the extent that it is party to the generalized breakdown of codes and overcodings, and evolves entirely within this new axiomatic that results from a hitherto unknown conjunction. Once again, this axiomatic is not the invention of capitalism, since it is identical with capital itself. On the contrary, capitalism is its offspring, it's its result. Capitalism merely ensures the regulation of the axiomatic. It regulates or even organizes the failures of the axiomatic as conditions of the latter's operation. It watches over or directs progress towards a saturation of the axiomatic and the corresponding widenings of its limits. Never before has a state lost so much of its power. Interesting, right? In order to enter with so much force into the service of the signs of economic power. Right? And capitalism, despite what is said to the contrary, assumed this role very early, in fact, from the start. From its gestation in forms still semi-feudal or monarchic, from the standpoint of the flow of free workers, that's the play that I was going on, the Volga for free as a bird workers, the control of manual labor and of wages, from the standpoint of the flow of industrial and commercial production and the granting of monopolies, favorable conditions for accumulation and the struggle against overproduction. So they're covering many of the themes that go on in the Marxian literature. There's never been a liberal capitalism. This is very interesting. You know, anybody talk to you about, you know, and everybody knows the slogan, the bosses have two parties, we have none, right? That's your difference, essential difference between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. The bosses have two parties. They represent different factions of capital. Yeah, anyway. Okay, so the action against monopolies goes first back to a time when commercial and financial capital is still allied with the old system of production. And when nascent industrial capitalism can secure its production and its market only by obtaining the abolition of such privileges, that the struggle against monopolistic privileges does not imply any struggle against the very principle of state control. So we're going to hear about suits against Google, Facebook. We're going to hear this ad infinitum for the next 10, hopefully I'm here 20 years or whatever, every day, right? Providing the state sees fit can be seen clearly in mercantilism inasmuch as it expresses the new commercial functions of a capital that is secured for itself direct interests in production. As a general rule, state controls and regulation tend to disappear or diminish only in situations where there's abundant labor supply and an unusual expansion of markets. That is, when capitalism functions with a very small number of axioms within relative limits that are sufficiently wide. This situation ceased to exist long ago, and one must regard as a decisive factor in this evolution the organization of a powerful working class. This is crucial. That required a higher and stable level of employment and forced capitalism to multiply its axioms while having at the same time to reproduce its limits. And this is the paradox, very interesting, on an ever-expanding scale, the axiomatic from the displacement of the center to the periphery. We can read here in our time, outsourcing, shift to manufacturing centers, all these things. Capitalism was able to digest, and this is very important, I think, and where they're going with its relative limit, was able to digest the Russian Revolution only by continually abiding new axioms to the old ones. Yeah, what are the two gains of labor, right? Social Security, unemployment in the 30s, Medicare and Medicaid in the 60s. These are the two major gains of labor. And when did they come up? At what times, right? Right? 1930s, 1960s. Only by, an axiom for the working class, for the unions, and so on, right? But the problem today is they don't need axioms for the unions anymore. Witness Amazon in Bessemer, Alabama, that the propaganda is so great, there's no longer ideological state apparatuses at work, just repressive state apparatuses that will work with the major transnational corporations. It's interesting, but it is always prepared, capitalism, to add more axioms. It adds axioms for anything. I got a letter from Bush today because I made last year less than, whatever the cutoff, but 80 grand a year, whatever it was. I got the check and he wanted to thank me for receiving the check, right? That America's back. I mean, I can get the letter. I don't know how many of you got this, but yeah, I got my little government tokenism here that,
Glad you're doing your part, Michael.
What's that? I'm sorry.
I
Yeah,
said,
I'm doing
we're
my
all glad
part.
you're doing your
Keep
part.
America whole and healthy, filled with mother's milk and, you know, and his American pie. And I'll never quote George Carlin. They call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe in it. Anyway, yeah, which was a great thing. But listen to what he does. But it's always prepared. And this is what they're looking at, to add more axioms, right? It adds axioms for many other things besides, things that are much smaller and tiny, even absurdly insignificant. It has a peculiar passion for such things that leaves the essential, or the core, if you will, or the nucleus completely unchanged. There's no attempt to look at systemic. The state is thus induced to play an increasingly important role in the regulation. This is the role of the state, the regulation of axiomatized flows, right? Think about this when you read the new bills before Congress, right? In a sense, you know, they're going in. With regard to production and its planning, the economy and its monetization, and surplus value and its absorption by the state apparatus itself. The regulative functions of the state do not employ any side of arbitration between social classes. That the state is entirely in the service of the so-called ruling class is an obvious practical fact, but a fact that does not reveal its theoretical foundation. The latter is simple to explain. From the viewpoint of the capitalist axiomatic, there is only one class, a class with a universalist vocation, the bourgeoisie. Plekhanov notes that the French school of the 19th century, under the influence of Saint-Simon, should be credited with the discovery of class struggle and its role in history. Precisely the same men who praised the struggle of the bourgeois class against the nobility and feudalism, and who come to a halt before the proletariat and deny that there can be any difference in class between the industrialist, the banker, and the worker. We're all in this together. Please wear your mask, right? Very interesting, right? And again, they add, but only a fusion into one and the same flow as with profits and wages. This proportion, you know, you go to union, I've been to about 9 union negotiations over many years in academic things, and one time to the transit workers. And the first thing you hear from the other side, we're all stakeholders.
Right, stakeholders.
Management uses this word ad infinitum. And of course, you know what I say to this, but anyway, yeah, where's the stake I can drive through your heart? But anyway, yeah. Anyway, classes, and this is very interesting. This proposition contains something other than an ideological blindness or denial. Classes are the negative of castes and statutes. Classes are orders, castes, and statutes that have been decoded. Interesting. To reread history through the class struggle is to read it in terms of the bourgeoisie as the decoding and the decoded class. This is a radical reading, you know, in a way. You go to a Marxist, school and you start speaking this way, they're going to throw you out and tell you're reactionary. Think about this. It is the only class as such. Yeah, listen, I'm listening, Carl. Yeah.
But it seems like this is very much in keeping with Marx, and Marx talking
Yes, of
about
course.
the revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie.
You know, Marx's famous statement, and Freud should have said this too.
Right.
He said, I am not a Marxist.
Right.
When he was asked, he said, I am not a Marxist. Freud should have said, I'm not a Freudian. You know, he should have had the same reply on that end. Lacan always said, I'm not Lacanian, I'm a Freudian. You know, this was always his proposition when asked. Okay, it is the only class as such, inasmuch as it leads the struggle, and this is interesting, against codes and merges with the generalized decoding of flows. In this capacity, it is sufficient to fill the capitalist field of immanence. And in point of fact, something new occurs with the rise of the bourgeoisie. And here you go, David, the disappearance of enjoyment as an end. Right? Interesting, right? The disappearance of enjoyment as an end. The new conception of the conjunction according to which the sole end is abstract wealth and its realization in forms other than consumption. The generalized slavery of the despotic state at least implied the existence of masters. and an apparatus of anti-production distinct from the sphere of production. But the bourgeois field of immanence, as delimited by the conjunction of the decoded flows, the negation of any transcendence or exterior limit, and the effusion of anti-production inside production itself, institutes an unrivaled slavery. This is very, very extreme, right? But I think on point. An unrivaled slavery, an unprecedented subjugation. There are no longer even any masters, but only slaves commanding other slaves. Yeah, how's that for Frederick Laudon, Bruno, right? There is no longer any need to burden the animal from the outside. It shoulders its own burden. Not that man is ever the slave of technical machines. He is rather the slave of the social machine. The bourgeois sets the example. He absorbs surplus value for ends that, taken as a whole, have nothing to do with his own enjoyment. More utterly enslaved than the lowest of slaves, he is the first servant of the ravenous machine, the beast of the reproduction of capital, internalization of the infant debt. I too am a slave. These are the new words spoken by the master. Brilliant. Really. Only as a personified capital is the capitalist respectable. As such, he shares with the miser the passion for wealth as wealth. But that which is in the miser is a mere idiosyncrasy. It is in the capitalist the effect of the social mechanism of which he is but one of the wheels. I think this is Marx in the Grundrisse. I may be wrong, but yeah. Well, it's actually yes, it's Marx in Capital in Volume 1. It will be said there's nonetheless a class that rules and a class that is ruled, both defined by surplus value. The distinction between the flow of financing and the flow of income and wages. But this is only partially true, since capitalism is born, and this is important too, to see this, and as Carl likes to say, it's complexity, in the conjunction of the two in the differential relations, and integrates them both in the continuously expanded reproduction of its limits. So that the bourgeois is justified in saying, not in terms of ideology, but in the very organization of his axiomatic. There's only one machine, that of the great mutant decoded flow, cut off from goods, and one class of servants, the decoding bourgeoisie, the class that decodes the castes and the statutes. And this draws from the machine an undivided flow of income convertible into consumer and production goods, a flow on which profits and wages are based. In short, the theoretical opposition is not between two classes, for it is the very notion of class insofar as it designates the negative of codes, and this implies there is only one class. The theoretical opposition lies elsewhere. It is between, on one hand, the decoded flows that enter in a class axiomatic on a full body of capital, and on the other hand, the decoded flows that free themselves from this axiomatic, just as they free themselves from the despotic signifier, that break through this wall and this wall of a wall and be flowing on the full body without organs. The opposition is between the class and those who are outside the class. It's interesting, another kind of thinking here, right? Very interesting, the outside the class. Between the servants of the machine and those who sabotage it, its cogs and wheels. Between the social machine's regime and that of the desiring machines. Between the relative interior limits and the absolute exterior limit. If you will, between the capitalists and the schizoids, in their basic intimacy at the level of decoding, in their basic antagonism at the level of the axiomatic, whence the resemblance in the 19th century socialist portraits of the proletariat between the latter and a perfect schizoid. So they're beginning to anticipate. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I just, like when you're reading this, just this section, I just thought of this. How would you see this relating to Hart and Negre and the idea of, they're trying to sort of reform this opposition? They still are talking about this kind of dichotomous opposition between it's not capital and the proletariat, it's, you know,
Yeah.
empire and the multitude.
Yeah, right. They have a very different notion. The multitude they take from Spinoza. They don't use the people in Rousseau's sense. And multitude is an anti-Hobbesian term. Hobbes could not stand the multitude, right? He really, so they use the multitude for a reason, right? In many ways, right? Spinoza uses the multitude, right, as well in the, in the.
Do you see a certain resonance between what they're doing and
Yeah,
what
sure.
Hart and Negre
Yeah,
are
sure.
doing? I mean, it
Sure.
seems like it's kind of
Absolutely.
operates.
No accident that Tony Negre was very close. I mean, he was, like, more than a brother with Guattari. And Deleuze wrote a very beautiful letter. I'll see, I used to have it somewhere. I can look around. A beautiful letter to get Negre to Paris when he was put in jail. A very, absolutely beautiful letter about the ability of Negre. And as most of you know, the lectures on the Grundrisse were because of Althusser. Althusser gave him the space at the university to give these lectures, made sure he got it, and yeah, this is what communist brotherhood can be about. In a way, don't go to jail, Tony. We've got a place for you here where your mind be used. Yeah, I think it's close, but what I want to get to, this is very interesting here. This is why the problem of a proletarian class begins, first of all, to praxis, right? Not just class consciousness in the Lukácsian sense, but to praxis. The task of the revolutionary socialist movement was to organize a bipolarity of the social field, a bipolarity of classes. Of course, it is possible to conceive a theoretical determination of the proletarian class at the level of production, those from whom surplus value is extorted, or at the level of money, income, and wages, right? But not only are these determinations sometimes too narrow and sometimes too wide, but the objective being they define as class interest remains, right? Purely virtual, so as long as it's not embodied in a consciousness that, to be sure, does not create it, but actualizes it in an organized party, suited to the task of conquering the state apparatus. If the movement of capitalism in this interplay of differential relations is to dodge any assignable fixed limit, to exceed and displace its interior limits, and to always effect breaks of breaks, then the socialist movement seems necessarily led to fix or assign a limit that differentiates the proletariat from the bourgeoisie. A great cleavage that will animate a struggle, not only economic and financial, but political as well. Now, the meaning of just such a conquest of the state apparatus has always been and remains problematical, right? And this, of course, goes into the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the transition. A supposedly socialist state implies a transformation of production, of the units of production and the economic rationale. But this transformation can only take place starting from an already conquered state that finds itself confronted by the same axiomatic problems of extraction of the surplus or surplus value, of accumulation and absorption, of the market and monetary reckoning. Consequently, either the proletariat prevails and transforms the apparatus in conformity with its objective interest, but these operations are carried out under the domination of its consciousness or the party vanguard, right? In a way. So we have the workers' councils, the Panacok, the Soviets, of course, and the Leninist notion of the vanguard party. That is for the benefit of a bureaucracy or technocracy that stands in for the bourgeois as the great absence class, or the bourgeoisie keeps its control of the state and is free to secrete its own techno-bureaucracy, and above all, to add a few more axioms for the recognition of the proletariat as a second class. It is correct to say that the alternative is not between the market and economic planning, since planning is necessarily introduced in the capitalist state, which Negre has written about, by the way, the Keynesian state, very, very beautifully. And the market subsists in the socialist state, if only as a monopolistic market of the state itself. And in effect, how does one define the true alternative without assuming all these problems resolved beforehand? The immense accomplishment, and this is interesting, of Lenin and the Russian Revolution was to have forged I like this, has forged a class consciousness consonant with the objective being or interest of the class, and as a consequence to have imposed on the capitalist countries a recognition of class bipolarity. Right? The recognition was given. A neutraliteit to the bourgeoisie, as David pointed out earlier. A lot of deferred denial and action going on. It arrived late. The letter arrived very late at its destination, right? But this great Leninist break, and this is interesting, this great Leninist break, and they consider Lenin a break, right? A rupture, and I like this. Revolution is rupture, did not prevent the resurrection of a state capitalism inside socialism itself any more than it prevented classical capitalism to getting around the break by continuing its veritable mole work, always affecting breaks of breaks that allowed it to integrate into its axiomatic sections of the newly recognized class, while throwing the uncontrollable revolutionary elements, no more controlled by official socialism than by capitalism itself, further into the distance, to the periphery, or into enclaves. Thus, the only choice left was between the new terroristic and rigid axiomatic, quickly saturated of the socialist state, and the old cynical axiomatic, all the more dangerous for being flexible and never saturated of the capitalist state. Yep. But in reality, the most direct question, and I think they're very sober here, is that not of knowing whether an industrial society can do without a surplus, without the absorption of the surplus, without a commodity exchanging and planner state, and even without an equivalence of the bourgeoisie. It is evident both that the answer is no, and that in these terms, the question is badly put. Nor is the question of knowing whether or not class consciousness embodied in a party or state betrays the objective class interest, to which a kind of potential spontaneity could be ascribed, suffocated by the agents claiming to represent that interest. And this is brilliant too. Sartre's analysis and the critique of dialectical reason, this is in volume 1, appears to us profoundly correct when he concludes that there does not exist any class spontaneity, but only a group spontaneity. Brilliant. Whence the necessity for distinguishing groups in fusion. And Lydia, you still here? Anyway, we can look at Black Lives Matter in this context through Sartre's eyes and Deleuze and Guattari, from the class which remains serial, represented by the party or state. And the two do not exist on the same scale. This is because class interest remains a function of the large molar aggregates. It merely defines a collective pre-conscious that is necessarily represented in a distinct consciousness that at this level does not even present any grounds for asking whether or not alienates or not, deforms or not. The problem is situated there between unconscious group desires, I think very important here, and pre-conscious class interests. Yeah. And I've been in struggles where I see this play out very many times. I mean, I'm sure everybody has. It is only starting from this point, as we shall see, that one is able to pose the questions issuing indirectly thereupon concerning the class pre-conscious and its representative forms of class consciousness and the nature of the interests and the processes of their realization. Reich always comes back to us with his innocent standards, claiming the rights of a prior distinction between desire and interest. This is interesting too. The leadership has no task more urgent, this is right, besides that of acquiring a precise understanding of the objective historical process, than to understand, A, what are the progressive desires, ideas and thoughts which are latent in people of different social strata, occupations, age groups, and sexes, and B, what are the desires, fears, thoughts, and ideas, traditional bonds, which prevent the progressive desires, ideas from developing. The leadership has a tendency rather to reply, when I hear the word desire, I reach for my gun. Of course, this is the play, on culture and Goebbels. When I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. which the surrealists did great stuff with. Desire can never be deceived. And this is where they're really trying to go again. It may be a new boss, the New Deal, but we won't get fooled again, right? That, what's happening. Interest can be deceived, unrecognized, or betrayed, but not desire. Whence Reich's cry, no, the masses were not deceived, and we mentioned this earlier. They desired fascism, and that is what has to be explained. It happens that one desires against one's own interests. Capitalism profits from this. But so does socialism, the party, and the party leadership. How does one explain the desire devotes itself to operations that are not failures of recognition, but rather perfectly reactionary, unconscious investments? And this is where Freud still plays out with them very much, to uncover those reactionary, unconscious investments. And what does Reich mean when he speaks of traditional bonds? The latter also belong to the historical process and bring us back to the modern functions of the state. Civilized modern societies are defined by processes of decoding and deterritorialization. But what they deterritorialize with one hand, they reterritorialize with another. There's an old blues song about the cow. One hand will give, one hand would take. That's all we know. That's how we live. It's an old Southern blues song that came out of the Robert Johnson school. Anyway, these neo-territorialities are often artificial, residual, archaic, but they are archaisms having a perfectly current function, our modern way of imbricating, of sectioning off, of reintroducing code fragments, resuscitating old codes, inventing pseudo-codes or jargons. We're going to hear this all the time. We're going to hear accountability. This is your Black Lives, this is the new mantra. Accountability, but no justice so far. Another mantra going on. I'm not knocking the movement. Please don't hear me that way, but it becomes the resuscitation of old codes, right? What is accountability? At the same time, corporate accountability for the environment. Give them carbon tax credits, all this. I think they're pointing in this direction. As neo-archaism, as Edgar Morin, a communication theorist, put it, these modern archaisms are extremely complex and varied. Some are mainly folkloric, but they nonetheless represent social and potentially political forces, from domino players to home brewers via the veterans of foreign wars. Others are enclaves where archaism is just as capable of nourishing a modern fascism as of freeing a revolutionary charge. The ethnic minorities, these are all 70s, the Basque problem, the Irish Catholics, the Indian reservations. Some of these are, all of which are still with us, by the way. Some of these archaisms take form as if spontaneously in the very current of the movement of deterritorialization, neighborhood territorialities, territories of the larger aggregates gained. And by the way, speaking of neighborhood territorialities, this is how the neoconservatives took power, in the 70s. They first of all invaded the prisons. Who went to prison? John Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman. They brought with them not Deleuze and Guattari or Franz Fanon, Karl Marx or Sigmund Freud. They brought the Bible. A whole generation is educated on the new neocon that goes into prison. Build up the muscle. Forget the muscle in your head. There was a really different shift in this. As well, of course, is taking control of local school boards, taking control of all kinds of local entities. The neocons, understood what they're talking about better than the left, who's always, it's global interconnections, of course, but what happened to the local movements, right, etc., and building power. Others are organized or promoted by the state, even though they might turn against the state and cause it serious problems. Regionalism, nationalism. The fascist state has been, without doubt, capitalism's most fantastic attempt at economic and political reterritorialization. Make America great again, America's back, etc. But the socialist state also has its own minorities, its own territorialities, which reform themselves against the state or which the state instigates and organizes. Russian nationalism, we see this in the breakup of the Soviet Union constantly. The territoriality of the party. The proletariat was only able to constitute it as a class on the basis of artificial neo-territorialities. In parallel fashion, the bourgeoisie re-territorializes itself in forms that are at times the most archaic, right? Very interesting. And anyway, I won't read any more. I mean, this is very interesting. Is Carl still here? He goes into the origin of Bruno's here. Down a whole paragraph, this essential aspect of the regulation played by the state regulative capital, is even more readily understood if one sees it as directly based on the social and economic axiomatic of capitalism as such. It is the very conjunction of the deterritorialized flows that delineates archaic or artificial neo-territorialities. Marx has shown what was the foundation of political economy, properly speaking, the discovery of an abstract subjective essence of wealth in labor or production and in desire as well, it would seem. It was an immense step forward for Adam Smith to throw out every limiting specification of wealth-creating activity, not only manufacturing or commercial agricultural labor, but one as well as another, labor in general, the abstract universality of wealth-creating activity. Adam Smith is the one who saw labor as the, essence of value. Here we have the great movement of decoding, deterritorialization. The nature of wealth is no longer to be sought on the side of the object under exterior conditions in the territorial despotic machine. But Marx is quick to add that this essentially cynical discovery finds itself rectified by a new territorialization in the form of a new fetishism or a new hypocrisy. Production as the abstract subjective essence is discovered only in the forms of property that objectifies it all over again, that alienates it by re-territorializing it. Although they had a presentiment of the subjective nature of wealth, the mercantilists had determined it as a special activity still tied to money-creating despotic machine. The physiocrats, pushing this presentiment further, had tied subjective activity to a territorial or re-territorialized machine in the form of agriculture and landed property. And even Adam Smith discovers the great essence of wealth, abstract and subjective, industrial and deterritorialized, only by immediately re-territorializing as the private ownership of the means of production. Nor can one say in this regard the so-called common ownership changes the direction of the movement. Moreover, if it is not a question of writing the history of political economy, but the real history of the corresponding society, one is better able to understand why capitalism is continually re-territorializing with one hand what it is deterritorializing with the other. And the double movement, Marx analyzes, I won't go to production as an end in itself. This is their reading of Marx later, in this text before we get to Oedipus at last, which is the last section. So they move after this section on Marx Capital and what the bourgeois class does in the section on the characteristics of axiomatics and codes and the formulas of money, commodity, money, and then the transition to M prime, and how we get that and what classes are. Then we get into Oedipus at last. How is Oedipus formed? In some ways, how is Freud formed? Right? And this goes on, how the family gets placed outside the social field, right? And so this plays out, and I won't read everything because you've heard me read a lot tonight. Oedipus on page 266. The displaced or internalized limit where desire lets itself be caught. So again, they're very worried about being entrapped by the triangulation and by these moments, right? That somehow the cure itself is the infinite, misery. in some ways for them. In some ways they go that way. And then he goes on, I'll read one point. It's not via a flow of shit or a wave of incest that Oedipus arrives, but via the decoded flows of capital hyphen money. This is on page 267. I repeat, it is not via a flow of shit or a wave of incest that Oedipus arrives, but via the decoded flows of capital money. The waves of incest and shits are only secondary derivatives of the latter, insofar as they transport the private persons to which the flows of capital are reduced or applied, which explains the complex origin of the relation that is completely distorted in the this is Guattari speaking, in the psychoanalytic equation, shit equals money. In reality, it is a question of encounters or conjunctions of derivatives and resultants between decoded flows. In Oedipus, there's a recapitulation of the three states or the three machines. For Oedipus makes ready in the territorial machine as an empty, unoccupied limit. It takes form in the despotic machine as a symbolically occupied limit, but it is filled and carried to completion only by becoming the imaginary Oedipus of the capitalist machine. The despotic machine preserved the primitive territorialities, and the capitalist machine resuscitates the Urstadt as one of the poles of its axiomatic. It makes the despot into one of its images. And just think of the projections we have of the despots out there. We can go through the list just in the 20th century of the despots, right? This is why Oedipus gathers up everything. Everything is found again in Oedipus, which is indeed the result of universal history, but in the singular sense in which capital is already this result. Fetishes, idols, images, and simulacra. Here we have the whole series. Territorial fetishes, despotic idols or symbols, then everything is recapitulated in the images of capitalism, which shapes and reduces them to the Oedipal simulacrum. The representatives of the local group with Laius, King Laius, Oedipus's father, the territoriality with Jocasta, the mother and the lover, the double wife, the despot with Oedipus, the king himself, a motley painting of everything that has ever been believed. It comes as no surprise that Freud looks to Sophocles for the central image of Oedipus the despot. The myth become tragedy in order to make the image radiate in two contrary directions. One, the ritual primitive direction of totem and taboo, Freud's Ursprung story in some ways of the beginning of the law and the law of castration and kinship relations, and the private direction of modern man, the dreamer. Oedipus can be a myth, a tragedy, or a dream. It always expresses the displacement of the limit. Oedipus would be nothing if the symbolic position of an object from on high in the despotic machine did not first make possible this folding and flattening operations that will constitute Oedipus in the modern social field. The triangulation's cause, whence the extreme importance, but also the indeterminate nature, non-decidability of the argument advanced by psychoanalysis' most profound innovator, which makes the displaced limit pass between the symbolic and the imaginary, between symbolic castration and imaginary Oedipus. For castration in the order of the despotic signifier as the law of the despot on the effect from the object on high is in reality the formal condition on which Oedipal images will be deployed in the immanence left uncovered by the withdrawal of the signifier. I started here tonight, or later in response to David, I reach desire when I arrive at castration. What does the desired castration equation signify, if not in fact a prodigious operation that consists in replacing desire under the law of the despot, in introducing lack there at the deepest levels, and in rescuing us from Oedipus by means of a fantastic regression, a fantastic and brilliant regression. Someone had to do it, And then he goes on to Lacan, etc., and then talks about the infinite debt vis-a-vis Nietzsche and kind of covers there. So for next week, I know it's time. Anybody want to say anything? I know it's late. The last section here, to overturn the theater of representation, we can go back, but to overturn the theater of representation into the order of desiring production, to go back to this term that, Carl has issues with, and maybe others do too, this notion of desiring. This is the whole task of schizoid analysis, and the schizoid analysis chapter. Let's go to it. We can go back and forth. I would like us to do, up to through psychoanalysis and capitalism, right? There's a whole section again on capitalism and the theater of representation. So maybe we can go as far as, I think the first section is section 1, the social field. It goes, why don't we go from 273 to 296? Yeah, we'll do that, right? Yeah, or really till, I don't know what we could go to 321. That's a lot though. Maybe part of section 3, psychoanalysis and capitalism. But you need to get the idea of how they're bringing this up as an introduction and then 2 positive tasks, right? So this is programmatic, right, in many ways, right? The desiring production, partial objects. So they'll go back to a lot of things they've discussed. Yes, David, you had a question or, yeah? No? You're mute, you're mute.
Oh, thanks.
No problem. Yeah.
I was curious if you had a recommendation. If you're kind of, not so well versed in philosophy, is there a book that you would recommend reading alongside this that would be a good way of really getting into, Marx, Nietzsche, these other people who kind of precede this, like something like Terry Eagleton, The Ideology of the Aesthetic, something that would be a way of kind of boning up to get more of a sense of where they're coming from?
I would, at one level, I still like Brian Masumi's book on User's Guide to Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Massumi, Brian Masumi. It was written, he was a student of Deleuze's and understood this book pretty good. It's a user's guide. He talks about force and action and all of that. Another thing I would recommend is the first section of Deleuze's great book of ontology called Difference in Repetition, which was written during the period that they're doing this and published well before Anti-Oedipus, right? I would recommend that too. I don't want to go so far where I'm overburdening you, but I'm trying to think of a book of philosophy. Look, there's obviously so much going on here. Again, the Genealogy of Morals is really worth reading again.
Okay.
The question of the creditor and debtor. If I had one book to put on, if you're going to copulate here, right, for the book, so to speak, I put the Genealogy of Morals on top, right, in a way. Bruno, you want to make
no, I just saw today that there is a book coming out called the Incomplete Project of Schizoanalysis, but it's not out yet. But
okay,
just the
I think we're dealing with that too. Maybe we'll have better insights in the book. Do you know who it's by? Or
yeah, I don't know him. I never read anything. Jan Buchanan. Jan Buchanan.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, he's an Englishman. Yeah, I'm not so sure. But anyway, yeah. More summary, plot summary, and theoretically engaged. But yes, it could be good as a pony. Yeah.
Okay.
But it is an unfinished project. And I'm glad you brought that up.
Absolutely.
Very much an unfinished project, just like psychoanalysis.
Right.
It's an unfinished project too. And again, remember, and I just want to point that out before we go. And hey, Phil, good to see you. The question again here is working side by side. There is a kind of parallelism going on with schizoid analysis and psychoanalysis. Okay, so it's not that they're throwing out all the advances. by any
No,
means.
but it
It's happened.
is.
Yeah, but go ahead, Bruno.
It is no, it is a radical take on
Yes,
psychoanalysis
it is.
for sure. So next time I'm sure we'll see the schizo
Yeah,
analysis more. Yeah, I mean,
I hope clear. Yeah,
but
yeah.
no, one thing that I want to say, maybe because the question of the family, especially the relationship, no, the son, father, no, I mean, maybe we can address that there is this, the movies by the Dardenne brothers, right? The
Yeah, I
Belgian.
know the movies. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, they problematize in a very interesting way precisely that type of
Right.
relationship from in the context of something that always comes from the outside, whether it's migration
Yeah,
or any.
yeah.
So I mean, so that may be, I don't
What's an
know.
interesting film post Anti-Oedipus, to my mind, would be Jonah Will Be 25 in the year 2000,
Mm.
because you didn't have the daddy, mommy, me triangulations going on. It
Yeah.
was a group of revolutionaries, ex-revolutionaries, contemporary workers, school teachers, clerks at the supermarket who would check out the seniors with no money, et cetera, who got fired, of course. But it was a different kind of notion of collective desire and group desire. Very beautiful film. I mean, and I love the end scene. But yes, on down there. But you're right, the Dardenne, they have a very good take on this as well. But to me, the Jonah Will Be 25 in the year
I'll watch
2000
it again.
is an attempt to go beyond the institutional confines of both psychoanalysis and party orthodox Marxism, right? In many ways. And again, these are their two antagonists as they go forward, as well as being totally anti-capitalist. There's no question about that. They're not anti-psychoanalysis like they are anti-capitalist. I mean, I want to point that out. There's a critique on. Yes, David. Yeah. You're mute. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. It's a strange thing because it has to unmute, but then it says mute.
Right. I understand. Yeah.
It's tricky. But one of the things I thought you might find funny, you might already be into this, is there's a sitcom from the early 2000s called Malcolm in the Middle, which became.
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
Did you watch that?
I watched a little bit of it. Yeah.
Right. The guy who created that, Linwood Boomer, did cite Deleuze and Guattari as one of his influences.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
Because he was very interested in
I'll take a look at maybe a couple of episodes before next.
What's the title again, David?
Malcolm in the Middle.
It's
Malcolm in the Middle.
Funny show. But Michael, if you are, or Bruno, if you're going to watch, I would suggest I think it's season 5. There's an episode called Billboard.
Okay.
And the boys get stranded on top of this billboard that they're defacing, but it's the most sophisticated in terms of the dialectic of power, the sense of this beautiful stripper who's supposed to be selling things, and the consumerism and the way the audience gets into this frenzy of potential, rebellion. But the mother figure of Lois reigns supreme. But it's really a scream, but it really does reflect this.
Right, I'll check it out. Yeah, I didn't know they had dedicated
They were
or centered the influence of Deleuze. Yeah. Chantal Ackerman, the filmmaker, who I unfortunately committed suicide. She probably had at least 4 or 5 more good films in her, but she just never got over the death of her mother, who was actually had been in the camp. She was very, very close to Deleuze in many ways. And, they were close to this new generation of filmmakers also, and this was really a very free, open, group, in a sense. This was not a closed, power hungry. They were not interested, one thing I like about Guattari and Deleuze, they were not really interested they're not power hungry. They were not climbers in the institution, etc. They were very free people. They were very much interested in liberation. They weren't humanists, but they were very interested, both of them, in liberation. Yeah, in the most profound sense. I think, one thing I like about him. I like Foucault's, introduction to this too.
Right.
Let go, right?
But it's just an odd observation, but I'm not surprised in that in being, say, in a psychiatry residency or in an analytic training program, it did seem the people who were most power hungry had the least intellectual accomplishment.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It was almost like the power was necessary for them because somehow they realized they weren't writing books. They weren't thinking deep thoughts. They weren't shaking it up. They were just bureaucrats. And so
Right.
it drew
Right.
them to say, we can control the flow of something because we don't have a flow of our own.
Right. There you go. That's a good point too. Yeah. They're not interested though, Deleuze and Guattari, in controlling the flow.
No.
Yeah, believe me there. It is a book of flows without, the streams are always, moving. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, well, good. Good to see everybody. Thank you for staying so late. Good to see you, Phil. You're well, Phil? And good. Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you all.